49. Blood drop from the trail left at 875 South Bundy, shown in close-up in photograph E, and shown in perspective in photograph D. You recall saying that?
That's correct.
And you tested that initially to determine if it was of human origin?
Yes.
And with respect to the blood samples that were retrieved from the defendant and from Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson, with respect to those samples, did you test them also?
Yes, I did.
What tests did you perform on those?
On those, I performed the ABO blood typing test, the Group 1 enzyme electrophoresis test, and the PGM subtype electrophoresis test.
And did you also subject the blood drop from the trail, item number 49, to those same tests?
Yes, I did.
Did you prepare a chart, sir, indicating what you found?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have a chart I previously shown to the defense as it marked Table 24.
All right.
Showing you People's 24, sir. Recognize what I'm showing you?
Yes, I do.
What does that chart show us?
Well, just a summary of the results of the analytical tests that were performed on those items.
With respect to the ABO typing performed on each of the blood samples, with respect to the blood from Nicole Simpson Brown, item number 59, the ABO typing result was?
That I determined that she was a type A.
And as for Ronald Goldman, item number 60?
In that case, I determined that the results indicate that he's a type O.
And as to the defendant, item number 17?
That he is a type A.
And as to item number 49, the blood drop?
That the tests indicate that it is a type A.
Now, what do you mean when you say indicate?
Well, during the course of ABO typing, there's actually two different constituents that are present in the blood that can determine what the ABO type is. One of them is called an antigen, and the other is called an antibody. If we only determine one of those two, we call it indicative of. If we're able to determine the presence of both the antigen and the antibody, and they confirm the type, then we just call it a type A, or a type O, or a type AB, or a type B, depending on whatever it turns out to be.
Does that mean when you say indicative of O that it might not be O?
No, it just means that I was only able to, either only one of the tests worked or I only ran one of the tests. I just was not able to confirm the results with the other one.
Have you performed ABO testing before, sir?
Yes, I have.
About how many times?
Well, I didn't break it. There's a variety of different type of ABO tests. I didn't break it down to the individual ones, but in my career so far, I've run an ABO typing test a little over 6,500 times.
In those 6,500 times, have you had the experience of doing the initial run for ABO typing and come up with an indication of a type, as you've indicated here, like indicative of A or indicative of O, and then had an opportunity to run the second test on the antibodies to confirm that result later?
Yes.
In any of those cases, did it turn out that the initial indicative of type, whether it be O, A, or A, B, or B, turned out to be wrong?
I don't know if I would say turned out to be wrong. Occasionally there are discrepancies that occur between the two, and then we come up with what's called an inconclusive result. Normally you can, through further testing, try and decide or determine why it may not have come out as clearly as you expected, but occasionally it does happen where your first indication, your first test is not how it's eventually reported.
And how often does that happen?
I don't have a number. It happens fairly rarely.
Now, in this case, after the ABO typing, did you perform further typing?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
Well, there was additional test run that I mentioned before, the enzyme group 1 test, which includes actually 3 different enzymes in one process. One of them is the ESD or esterase D that's indicated on the chart. Another is PGM, or phosphoglucomutase, and the third is GLO, or glyoxylase. Those three enzymes are all run in one process.
With respect to the Nicole Simpson Brown sample, item number 59, what was the ESD result?
A type 1.
With respect to Ronald Goldman, item number 60, what was the result?
Also a type 1.
And with respect to the defendant, item number 17?
Also is determined to be a type 1.
And with respect to item number 49, the blood drop?
That was also determined to be a type 1.
Thus far, with respect to the markers that you found in item number 49, excuse me, item number 49, would it be a fair statement that only Ronald Goldman's could be excluded from having been the source of that blood drop?
If our only population are the three people that are being described here, yes, he's the only one of those three that can currently be excluded as being the source of that blood drop.
Then you performed the PGM subtype test?
Yes.
And the result with respect to Nicole Simpson Brown in item number 59?
I determined that she was a PGM subtype 1+,
And Ronald Goldman, item number 60?
that he was a 2+, 1+,
And the defendant, item number 17?
was determined to be a 2+, 2-.
So each of the three parties there are a different PGM subtype, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
With respect to item number 49, the drop of blood on the trail at 875 South Bundy, what was the PGM subtype?
The PGM subtype on that sample was determined to be a 2+, 2-.
Based on the three people that you see on that chart, could Nicole Simpson Brown have left the blood drop at 875 South Bundy, marked item number 49?
No, with the inclusion of the PGM subtype information, she's excluded as being a source of that sample.
With respect to Ronald Goldman, based on the PGM subtype, could he have been a source of that blood drop on the trail known as item number 49 at 875 South Bundy?
No, he could not.
With respect to the defendant, could he have been the source of the blood drop that was found on the trail at 875 South Bundy, known as item number 49?
Yes, he can be included in the group of possibles.
Now, did you make some effort to determine what the frequency or number of percentage of the population that could have left the blood sample that you typed out in item number 49 as indicative of A, ESD type 1, PGM subtype 2+, 2-? What percentage of the population could have left that blood drop?
Okay, I determined that that combination of those three type genetic markers exists in approximately 0.43% of the general population.
Your Honor, we'll object to the admission of this evidence for lack of foundation. If the prosecution is going to offer a computation based on the multiplication of the frequency of three different types or enzymes in the blood, we're going to have to show that these are independent random variables that can be multiplied, and there's been no foundation for the independence of each of these calculations.
Well, there's been no foundation as to how this particular number has been arrived at, so maybe you want to go into that.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Tell us how you arrived at that frequency, sir.
Well, within our laboratory, since actually the beginning of the serology unit, we have kept information on all the whole bloods that have been run by that unit, all the genetic marker types that have been determined on all the victims, suspects, witnesses, whatever blood sample happened to come into the laboratory. And through doing that and identifying the different types, we've been able to establish percentages of the population that have a particular type. For example, in the ABO blood typing system, we've determined that approximately 34% of the population is a type A, approximately 16% is a type B, approximately 4% is a type AB, and approximately 46% is a type O.
And how are those tables compiled, if you know?
The tables or the information is just an ongoing process. For the last approximately 10 years or so, have on a annual or semi-annual basis, added up all the types that we've determined during that previous time period, added it to the quantity that we had before, and performed the calculations.
And approximately how many times have you performed such calculations, sir?
Like I said, I do it approximately annually, anywhere from 9 to 18 months, and I would say maybe 9 or 10 times we brought it up to date.
And on how many occasions have the people in your lab testified to frequencies of types that are found in evidence stains and in various persons in courts of law?
Oh, I'm not sure I can give a specific number on it. I know that I have testified personally in bloodstain type cases approximately 115 times. Out of that, frequencies are brought up in at least half of those.
And in each case, was the frequency based on the tables you've mentioned using the multiplication system admitted in the court?
Yes, it has.
Is the system of multiplying each of the factors to achieve a frequency, an overall frequency, a method that is accepted in the scientific community, sir?
Yes, it is.
And then you reported that the frequency you found to be for the typing that you found in the blood drop on the trail at 875 South Bundy was 0.43%?
Approximately that, yes.
Your Honor, if we could call the other witness.
All right.
Mr. Matheson, how many PGM subtype tests has your laboratory performed?
Well, I have specific figures on the number that I have run. I determined that I've done approximately 1,000 items by the PGM subtype method. The only information I can supply you as far as overall laboratory is since we started computerizing our statistics, which was the first part of 1990, and since then the laboratory as a whole has done a little over 1,800 items by that method.
Now, you indicated that you've done about 6,500 ABO typing tests.
Yes, that's correct.
But you've done less than 1,000 PGM subtype tests.
No, slightly over 1,000, that's correct.
All right. So you do a PGM subtype in about 1 out of 6 of the tests where you do an ABO type.
That's approximately how the math works out, yeah.
How do you select which cases you're going to do a PGM subtype?
Well, it depends an awful lot on how much sample there is to begin with. Our protocol has tended to be to do the ABO first and then go on to the electrophoresis systems. I've mentioned earlier this group 1 system, which includes PGM as one of the enzymes in it, that you normally try and run first and determine what the PGM type is, not the subtype. And if you don't get a PGM type, then there's no reason to expend further sample running the subtype system on it. So many times we don't run it.
Would you say then that there's some sort of random selection of the PGM subtypes from the larger group of ABO types that you do?
You mean as far as the ones that appear in our frequency charts or in the ones that are run?
What I'm saying is that the individual cases where you have determined to run a PGM subtype are not a random sample of the ABO type test that you've done.
I am not totally sure what you mean by random. I do know that, we follow certain criteria as to whether we run a particular test, and it depends on the quality of the sample.
This is Peter Jennings in New York. Because this is complicated to some of us, we're going to risk one interruption here and ask for a comment from Dr. Cyril Wecht, who's joined us this morning. He's an independent forensic pathologist living in Pittsburgh. Mr. Wecht, do I understand the following to be correct, that using an ABO test and enzyme testing, the criminalist here concludes that only O.J. Simpson, of the 3 people, Nicole Simpson, Ronald Goldman, and O.J. Simpson, could be responsible for the blood droplets at the scene of the crime?
Yes, if these tests prove to be unchallenged and the specimen is properly collected and not contaminated, then there's no problem in differentiating among the 3 sets of blood stains. The question ultimately will be to determine that those separate 5 drops do come from O.J. Simpson. That will not be a problem to show that they do not come from Nicole Simpson or from Ron Goldman.
And when he says this defines this blood group, including Mr. Simpson, as being roughly 0.43% of the general population, that's exactly what he's saying, that that's how many people in the United States qualify in this blood group?
Yes, now he's basing this on his own analyses over the years of approximately 6,500 or so cases. I think the defense is going to probe a lot more into that to demonstrate that the universe is a lot bigger, including the universe of greater Los Angeles.
And two other questions, quite simple ones. These are all standard tests which we're looking at here on this diagram?
These are standard tests which are performed in crime labs in every metropolitan area somewhere in America each day.
And how reliable are they?
They are quite reliable if the specimens have been collected properly, not contaminated, and the people doing the test are experienced and competent.
And because he's being challenged, can we go back to the card for just a second there, if we could go back to that graphic. Because he's being charged or challenged here on the PGM testing, the subtype testing at the bottom, please remind us again what precisely that is.
That is a specific enzyme test. It's something that is relatively new. It goes back, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so, and it categorizes the much broader division of ABO typing.
In other words,
gives you much greater specificity.
I apologize. In other words, it's a refinement of a more general test.
Yes, it's a breaking down and a narrowing of the population which might have that particular type.
Thank you very much. Let's go back to the testimony.
In the PGM subtype system, it doesn't vary quite as much as that.
You're not aware that there have been reports in PGM subtypes of ratios as great as 3 to 1 between races?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me that if in specific populations it can vary by that much. That's one reason why up to this point I've specifically mentioned that these frequency determinations were approximations.
And what you've done in order to come up with this 0.43% or 1 in 200 is simply take your calculations of the frequency of each of the markers and then multiply them together to come up with 1 in 200.
With the 0.43, that's correct. And then I kind of rounded up for ease of understanding to approximately 1 in 200.
Well, what is the frequency of type A that you use to multiply?
For the data that I have there, I use 33.7%.
And for the PGM subtype 2 plus 2 minus?
1.6%.
And you simply multiply those together to get the 0.43%.
Well, also included in there is the esterase D type 1, which I use 79.6%.
Now, you have made no effort to correlate the frequency of PGM subtype with the frequency of a particular result in the ABO test, have you?
Oh, you mean to see if there's any sort of correlation between the two?
Exactly.
No, within our laboratory we have not done that. I have learned throughout my training and have been advised that they are independent.
Been advised by who?
I don't have any specific name or reference. It's just been something that's been occurred during the course of the last 12 years of my serology training. It's my understanding that they are independent factors.
There's none of the testing that you have done or the accumulation of data that you have done attempts to correlate how frequently you would have a 2 plus 2 minus, for example, in an A blood sample as opposed to a B blood sample or an O blood sample or an AB blood sample.
No, within our laboratory we have never done those calculations.
Your Honor, we would renew our objection based on People versus Collins that the multiplication of these factors is improper unless they can lay a foundation to show the independent appearance of each of these factors that they're multiplying.
Ms. Clark?
Yes, Your Honor. Counsel's raising the possibility of linkage, and I think that with maybe a little bit further questioning I can establish that is not an issue in these particular markers. That's more an issue in other areas, if I may.
All right.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the term linkage, sir?
Yes, I am.
Are you familiar with any studies that discuss the possibility of linkage in the systems that you've tested for the purposes of your testimony today?
In this particular case, dealing with these factors that have been around for and used for many, many years, I right here cannot specifically come up with any studies. It just is something that has existed for quite a while.
In the scientific community, has there been any concern voiced that with respect to the ESD or PGM subtype testing? I'm sorry. Where'd you leave off? Has there been any agreement concerning the existence or non-existence of linkage with respect to the ABO, ESD, and PGM subtype categories?
My understanding is there's general agreement that there is no linkage between any of these factors.
So that, as of this date, the scientific community agrees that there is not the problem of linkage that might otherwise skew the frequencies that are reported in all these cases where these particular markers are tested and found in blood types and in blood stains for the purpose of determining frequency.
That's correct. These sort of determinations have been being made and used in court for in excess of a decade.
Does the court wish me to further inquire?
No, the defense objection at this time
I'm going to
is
risk
over.
another brief interruption here. This is Peter Jennings, because this is an area in which the defense will be obliged to challenge the prosecution. Leslie Abramson, speaking as a defense attorney here now, is this likely to become controversial in the course of a trial, if there is a trial?
This is going to be very controversial. It comes up again if there's DNA testing. This question of what is the statistical significance of finding a particular blood type and sub-blood types is the raging controversy about this kind of evidence. And what the defense here is raising is one of the common criticisms of the statistics. And that is there are no studies being done to show, for example, if with type A blood, you tend to have more PGM 2+, 2- just because it's type A blood. If that were true, it would not be appropriate to multiply your ABO type by your PGM type, by your ESD type to come up with these statistics. Because if they are linked, if 2+, 2- is more frequent in all A sampling, if they are linked, then this kind of multiplication is wrong, and the statistical percentage is way too high. In other words, 1 in 200 is too extreme a number. It should be more, for example, like 1 in 10 or 1 in 20. That's what this controversy is about. It's complicated, but it's significant because it affects the weight of the evidence.
And though it is complicated, what a defense attorney would be trying to do here is to get his or her client as far removed from this particular blood sample as possible.
Well, what you want to show is that there's an enormous number of people who could have left that blood sample, more than 1 in 200 having that type. What you want to show is that there's hundreds of thousands of people rather than 5,000 or 10,000 people in a given area that could have left that blood. That's what this fight is all about.
Thank you very much.
The race of an individual whose blood that we're typing. And even if we did have a process of receiving it, there's some question as to the validity of how that's determined. Does the person that's drawing the blood just look at them and make their own determination, or what? So we prefer to go with the general characteristic.
If, for example, sir, you were to consider, first of all, well, the suspect is white. Therefore, I'm going to look at the tables for white people concerning the frequency of each marker that you're testing. Does that basically begin by narrowing the focus, by making the assumption that your evidence stain will be from a white person?
That's correct.
And in that regard, sir, then might that distort the frequency to make it unfairly more incriminating than you otherwise might have if you did not make any assumptions about the possible source of a blood stain?
Well, depending on how it happens to work out for that race, it could be either more or less incriminating.
But either way, it might distort your result if you were to narrow the focus by making an assumption that the person who left the stain is of the same race as the suspect.
That's correct.
And you did not do that in this case?
Not for purposes of the report or the chart.
Now, I take it, sir, then, that you found, as you reported, that the types detected in the blood drop of item 49 left on the trail at 875 South Bundy occurs in 0.43% of the population?
Approximately 0.43, that's correct.
And who, among the three that you have listed in the chart marked Peoples 24, could possibly have been the source of that stain?
Of the three people that are described both in my report and on the report, only Mr. Simpson can be included in that percentage of the population that could have left that stain.
So Mr. Simpson alone is included in the 0.43% of the population that could have left the blood drop on the trail at 875 South Bundy?
Of the three people that are mentioned on the chart, that's correct.
Then by my math, we may, if my math is any good, we may fairly...
This is KSTP Channel 5, St. Paul, Minneapolis. Live from your 24-hour news channel. This is Eyewitness News Midday.
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us on this Friday midday.
That's correct.
When you talk about that kind of frequency in a population the size of Los Angeles, for example, where we have 8 million people, you're saying that there are something on the order of 40,000 to 80,000 other people whose blood would produce the identical genetic markers that you have identified in item 49. Is that correct?
Approximately, that's correct, yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Ms. Clark?
Yes. Mr. Matheson, is there anything in the stain that we have marked as item number 49 that indicates to you that it is indeed a mixture of blood from two people?
Well, I would not necessarily know that. Like I mentioned earlier, the results would be the same, but there's nothing specific to indicate a mixture or whether it's not a mixture.
If indeed item number 49 came from two individuals, then they would both have to have a PGM subtype of 2+, 2-, somewhere in there?
You'd have to have at least one of the factors. If it's, approximately equal mix, like I mentioned earlier in the example that was given, if it was a different subtype, I would expect to see that other type show up. So if we did in fact have a mixture, the additional blood would have to be either a 2+, 2-, or a 2+, or a 2-.
And in fact, at least none of the other two victims have that.
That's correct.
And then that other person would also have to be a type 1 for ESD,
That's correct.
and an O or an A as to the ABO system.
Yes, that's correct.
Are you familiar with the term known as titering?
Yes.
Would you be able to, if asked, titer the stain known as item number 49 with respect to ESD or PGM subtype to determine the quantities with respect to being able to either rule out or limit the possibility of it being the blood of two different people?
I don't believe that would be appropriate testing to determine something like that. I'm not sure you could determine something like that.
Is there any testing you're aware of that could narrow down that could eliminate completely the possibility of that being two people?
Not to my knowledge, no.
But there was no independent evidence that you were able to find that determined that in fact that was indeed the blood of two people?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Ullman, anything else?
Yeah. Mr. Matheson, if we had a mixture that included PGM subtype 2+, 2- plus some other subtype, at some point in terms of the ratio of the mixture, the other subtype would be masked or would not appear in your results. Isn't that correct?
Is this similar to what we were talking about before, if there was a completely foreign type besides the 2+, 2-?
Right.
That's correct. If you got to a point where the other blood was diluted to the point where it didn't show up, then you wouldn't see it.
But you would still see the A result on the ABO test.
I suppose at some point it's possible where you'd still see the A and not the subtype.
Thank you. Nothing. Oh, excuse me, one minute. Do you make some sort of calculation of how much of the sample you are consuming in the course of the tests that you're running?
Are you asking me, can I tell you how much I use?
Yes.
Yes, I can. Refer to my analysis notes. I consumed a portion of one of the swatches that was available to me that was approximately 6 millimeters by 3, approximation. That left 2 swatches plus a portion of that one remaining that I worked on.
So each of these tests that you perform consumes a certain proportion of the sample that you have available to test.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. I'm sorry, one other question. With respect to the sample of the item number 17, the blood of O.J. Simpson, did you similarly inventory how much of that sample you consumed?
The proportion that would be consumed would have been a stain of consisting significantly less than one drop out of the vial, which when I received it had about 2 milliliters of blood in it. So it would have been a insignificant quantity to the amount that was present.
Thank you.
Ms. Clark, anything further?
No, thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Matheson. You may step down. Please do not discuss your testimony with anyone but the attorneys.
And good morning, Your Honor. The next witness for the people will be Dr. Irwin Gold.
Good morning. Please face the clerk and raise your right hand.
You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
State and spell your name for the record.
Irwin L. Golden. I-R-W-I-N-G-O-L-D-E-N.
You may inquire.
And thank you very much, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Golden. Good morning. Dr. Golden, you are a physician licensed to practice medicine in the state of California, are you not? Yes. And, sir, you are now employed by the Los Angeles County Department of the Coroner, is that correct? Yes. Dr. Golden, would you tell us what your job title is with the LA County Department of the Coroner?
I am a deputy medical examiner.
And would you describe for us, please, what your duties and functions are as a deputy medical examiner?
Well, as a deputy medical examiner, I am a physician specialist, and my duties are to perform autopsies on the decedents that come under our jurisdiction and to determine the cause and manner of death.
Sir, how long have you worked as a deputy medical examiner for the L.A. County Department of the Coroner?
I have completed 14 years. I'm in my 15th year now. I started in July of 1980.
And Dr. Golden, have you received any specialized education, training, or experience that qualifies you to hold your position as a deputy medical examiner?
Yes.
And please describe it for us.
Well, besides being a doctor of medicine, I've received 4 additional years of postgraduate residency training in pathology and 1 year of postgraduate residency training in forensic pathology. And I am certified by the American Board of Pathology in anatomical pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology.
Hey, doctor, let's break those down just a little bit. First of all, sir, you described yourself as a physician. You have testified that you are a physician. Is that correct?
Yes.
And where did you attend medical school, sir?
I attended the University of Illinois College of Medicine.
And when did you graduate, sir?
1966.
And you stated that following your graduation from the University of Illinois that you received some specialized training. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that was 4 years worth. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you mentioned that you are certified in certain, with regard to certain aspects of pathology. Is that correct?
Yes.
And by certified, are you referring to board certification?
Yes.
Would you describe for us, please, what it means to be board certified?
Well, the physician specialty groups have their own subspecialty boards which certify physicians as competent in their field. So, for example, an internist will have board certification in internal medicine. A surgeon may be board certified in surgery or general surgery. The pathology group or subspecialty has board certification in various branches of pathology.
And are there tests, are there requirements that enable one to become board certified, sir?
Yes, yes.
And do those tests and other requirements exist with regard to those certain specialties that you have mentioned thus far in your testimony?
Yes.
Now, amongst the certifications that you've indicated that you are certified in pathology, is that correct?
Anatomical pathology, clinical pathology, forensic pathology.
And would you describe the difference or distinction between those 3 types of pathology for us?
Well, anatomical pathology is that branch of clinical medicine that deals with the, I guess I could say, deals with autopsy pathology and surgical pathology, as well as biopsy, exfoliative cytology. In other words, that's a clinical subspecialty in some respects. It also deals with autopsy pathology. And clinical pathology is basically laboratory medicine. Those are those doctors who specialize in the use of laboratory methods for the study and diagnosis of disease.
And doctor, with regard to forensic pathology?
Well, forensic pathology deals in those aspects of pathology that come in relationship to the law. And as you know, forensic pathologists perform autopsies to determine the cause and manner of death, and forensic pathologists have special knowledge of violent or non-natural deaths. In other words, all the causes of death, all of the causes of death that are not due to natural causes, such as accident, homicide, suicide.
And sir, it's as a forensic pathologist that you work in your job for the LA County Department of the Coroner, is that correct?
Yes.
How long have you been working for the LA County Department of the Coroner?
Since 1980, July of 1980.
And sir, I have to assume since you've been working since July of 1980 for the Department of the Coroner, in that course of time you've had the opportunity and occasion to perform a number of autopsies, is that correct?
Yes.
Would you give us an estimate of approximately how many autopsies you've performed since starting work for the LA County Department of the Coroner?
I would say approximately, well, it's more than 5,000, somewhere in the mid 5,000 autopsies.
And Dr. Golden, in the course of your duties as a deputy medical examiner here in the County of Los Angeles, have you had occasion to testify into court and to render opinions as to cause of death as well as manner of death?
Yes.
And approximately how many times have you so testified?
Well, using an estimate that I testify 3 or 4 times a month, and let's say rounding that out to approximately 50 times a year, so in 14 years I would say close to 700 times, somewhere 650 to 700 times.
Dr. Golden, I would like to direct your attention to the date of June the 14th, 1994. Were you working in your capacity as a deputy medical examiner on that date?
Yes.
And were you at work in the early morning hours of that date?
Yes.
On the date of June the 14th, 1994, did you perform an autopsy upon the body of an individual identified to you as Nicole Brown Simpson?
Yes.
And sir, was a particular LA County coroner case number assigned to that case?
Yes.
And what number was assigned to that particular case, sir?
It was assigned case 94-05136.
Now, Dr. Golden, later in the morning of June the 14th, 1994, did you perform an autopsy upon the body of an individual identified to you as Ronald Golden?
Yes.
And Dr. Golden, was a coroner case number assigned to that particular case?
Yes.
What was that number, please?
94-05135.
Dr. Golden, in connection with each of those autopsies that you performed that morning, was an autopsy report prepared?
Yes.
And typically, what is included in an autopsy report?
Well, the autopsy report includes my protocol
and
transcription, which the protocol describes my autopsy findings. And that's what I personally have prepared through dictation and transcription. And it also includes a number of diagrams, which I have personally prepared. That is what I have personally prepared, plus a, if we want to be precise about this, there's also a form, medical report, Forensic Science Center, where I list the cause and manner of death. That is used by the certification desk to prepare the death certificate. So these are all prepared by me. The actual report contains additional pages that are not prepared by me, but they are included in the autopsy report.
They're part of the autopsy report package, are they not?
Yes.
And Dr. Golden, you've stated that you dictated notes and prepared diagrams with regard to your protocol. Is that correct?
Yes.
And does that mean, sir, at the time you're performing the autopsy, you are making notes of your findings, and that at some point contemporaneous with that, you are dictating your findings? Is that correct?
Yes.
And is it at some time subsequent to that that you prepare what is known as an autopsy report?
Yes.
At first, is that report prepared in rough, then reviewed by yourself, and then published in a final form?
Yes.
Now, with regard to the autopsy performed on Nicole Brown Simpson, when was that report prepared?
Well, the final copy was signed on June 16th, 1994. If that's what you meant by your question.
And the preparation of that report had taken place, I would have to assume, between the dates of June the 14th and June the 16th then. Is that correct?
Yes.
And with regard to the autopsy report pertaining to Ronald Goldman, sir, when was that report prepared and issued?
Well, between the 14th and the actually I signed the report on Mr. Goldman on June 17th, 1994.
Okay, thank you, sir. And Dr. Goldman, is the fact, is it not, that during the course of the autopsy, you direct that photographs be taken as well? Is that correct?
Yes.
And in the course of preparing an autopsy report, often it is good to look at those photographs in order to assist you in your findings and observations and conclusions. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in these two instances, were photographs taken of each autopsy while the autopsy was being performed?
Yes, they were.
Now, you testified before the Los Angeles County Grand Jury on the date of June the 20th, 1994, did you not?
Yes.
And after you testified before the grand jury, did your department issue some additional reports with regard to the autopsies performed on Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman?
Yes.
Are those reports characterized as addendums?
Yes.
Was there an addendum that was prepared with regard to Nicole Brown Simpson's autopsy report?
Yes.
And when was that report issued, sir?
It was issued July 1st, 1994.
And it is true, is it not, Dr. Golden, that an addendum to the Ronald Goldman autopsy report was issued on that same date?
Yes.
Now, with regard to the addendums, Dr. Golden, why were those addendums prepared?
Okay, I'll go through each case number. On Nicole Brown Simpson, addendum report was prepared for the following reasons. One, there were corrections of typographical errors. Two, upon review of the photographs, I made amendments, additions to the original report. And pertaining only to Nicole Brown Simpson, I made an addendum opinion after review of stored tissue.
And you had not had an opportunity to review that stored tissue prior to the issuance of the autopsy report, is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, sir, there were some additional correction of typos, amendments to the autopsy report of Ronald Goldman, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And, sir, before you issued the autopsy reports, or caused to be issued the autopsy reports with regard to each victim in this case, had you had an opportunity to review the photographs which were taken during each of the autopsies?
No.
Subsequent to the issuance of those reports, did you have an opportunity to make a detailed review of those photographs?
Yes.
And was it subsequent to the review of those photographs, a detailed review, that these addendums were issued?
Yes.
With regard to the addendum, does any of the basic data or findings of that were included in your original autopsy reports, does any of that change?
The changes were made to make the report more precise and detailed. The basic findings, and that includes findings as to the cause of death, were not changed. There were no changes pertaining to the internal examination. Basic measurements taken when I did the examination, including measurements on the stab wounds, were not changed. All of the basic measurements, particularly ones that would pertain to cause of death or weapon identification, were not changed. I changed some of the descriptions based on the photographs to provide a more precise and detailed description for this report.
Doctor, let's relate back to the morning of June the 14th, 1994. You commenced the autopsy procedure on the body of Nicole Brown Simpson at about 7:30 in the morning. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, I did.
And as part of your autopsy procedure or protocol, did you perform an external examination of Nicole's body?
Yes.
When you first saw the body, sir, was the body closed?
Yes.
Would you describe for us how you recall the body being closed?
Well, the decedent was wearing a short black dress that was blood-stained and a pair of black panties. That's what she was wearing.
What was the condition of the dress?
It appeared to be blood-stained.
Was it still damp or dry blood?
Well, it appeared to be partially damp.
And as part of your autopsy procedure, sir, did you cause the clothing to be removed?
Clothing was removed for photography purposes, and also the clothing had to be dried and preserved as evidence.
And did you direct that be done with regard to Nicole Brown Simpson's clothing?
Yes.
After the clothing was removed, Dr. Golden, did you determine the length of Nicole Brown Simpson's body?
Yes.
And what was that, sir?
Body length was 65 inches, or 5 feet 5 inches. Body weight was 129 pounds.
And Dr. Golden, did you determine the weight of Nicole Brown Simpson's body?
Yes, 129 pounds.
After determining the length and weight of Nicole's body, did you observe any evidence of injury to the neck of Nicole Brown Simpson?
Yes, I did.
Would you describe what you observed, Dr. Golden?
The decedent had an incised wound, that is a cutting wound of the neck, which extended from the left side of the neck across the larynx or voice box, and then angulated upwards towards the right ear.
And Dr. Golden, did you observe a number of stab wounds to the left side of Nicole Brown Simpson's neck?
Yes, I did.
Did you?
For the sake of the record, I have no objection to the doctor refreshing his memory or reading from his report, but I would like the record to indicate that that is being done.
All right. Have you been reading in response to the last couple of questions from your report, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you, Lawrence. Dr. Golden, did you create a diagram which reflected the approximate locations of the wounds that you just indicated in your testimony?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have here a diagram. I've previously shown this to counsel. It is a coroner's diagram. It reflects relative positions of the wounds thus far described by Dr. Golden. May this be people 25 for identification?
Yes.
Doctor, do you see the exhibit that has now been identified as people 25 for identification?
Yes.
Okay. And would you indicate for us what is depicted on that diagram?
Well, there's a lot depicted on the diagram, but basically there's a diagram of the cutting or incised wound on the neck, which is indicated here in this schematic that I'm pointing to now.
And for the record, sir, you're indicating a schematic of the neck and head portion of a human figure in the upper left-hand corner of the diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
Let us focus on that particular wound for a few moments, if we may. Doctor, you characterized that wound as a cutting or incised wound. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would you describe for us what a cutting or incised wound is?
An incised wound is an injury produced by a sharp object that cuts across the skin and produces an injury that is longer than it is deep.
Again, the record indicates that at least the first portion of that answer was read from, appeared to be read.
The witness is shaking his head no. I don't think he was reading it.
I wasn't reading anything.
Sorry, it appears to me that at this point, can the witness be instructed if he is going to read the refreshing memory that he just indicated, that we have no objection to that procedure?
All right. Anytime that you do elect to read something, if you could just state it so that the record is clear ultimately.
Now, doctor, with regard to the cutting or incised wound that you have described thus far in your testimony, would you give us the dimensions of that wound as noted by yourself during Nicole Brown Simpson's autopsy?
Right. Well, I can get that from the diagram chart. Basically, it was a gaping wound measuring 5.5 inches in length by 2.5 inches in width. And after alignment of the edges, that is, by moving them together and approximating the edges, the right-hand side measured 4 inches, and the left-hand side measured 2.5 inches.
And sir, when you refer to right-hand side and left-hand side, you are relating that in accord with a hypothetical midline, are you not?
Yes.
The midline would be a line hypothetically going down the middle of the body, is that correct?
Yes.
And when you're referring to right and left aspect of the midline, you are characterizing that as one would observe the decedent from the front, is that correct? Or the right side of the body and the left side of the body, in other words?
All descriptions refer to the decedent, not to the observer.
Very well. Now, with regard to the right earlobe and right side of the midline, you've stated that this wound appears to, after going across the neck, appears to angulate upward towards the right earlobe. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, with regard to the right side of the wound path, this would be referring to the right side of this hypothetical midline. Would you give us a description of your findings regarding the wound path and depth of wound?
Okay, well, I'll also look at my notes to refresh my memory, but this wound passed through the muscles on the right side of the neck and cut through the membrane between the larynx and the hyoid bone. See, the wound on the left side and cutting across the midline is transverse or horizontally. And in a single wound of this nature, I traced the depth as it went through anatomic structure. So it passed through the skin and the tissue beneath the subcutaneous tissue under the jaw, then across through the thyrohyoid membrane and ligament, and it went as deep as it went through that ligament posteriorly or backwards and transected the distal 1/3 of the epiglottis, then through the pharynx, and passed directly through to the vertebral column, which is the bone of the vertebral column, specifically the third cervical vertebra. And then I found a wound in the body of the third cervical vertebra, where the actual cut went in for 1/4 of an inch into the bone.
So this particular wound that you've described thus far was deep enough to cut through the neck and actually cause a nick on the spinal column, is that correct?
Yes.
And that is at the third cervical vertebrae, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, along the wound path, were any vital blood vessels severed?
Yes, and as I was saying, as the wound went up or angulated towards the right ear, it became more superficial and then ended in the skin below the right earlobe. Now, on my dissection of the wound, the right common carotid artery was severed or completely cut across, transected, and there was a 1/4 inch nick or cut on the right internal jugular vein. Now, that was on the right side. On the left side, tracing the wound from the midline towards the left, the left common carotid artery was transected, and the internal jugular vein was almost transected. There was a thin strand of tissue bridging across the two cut ends.
So, Dr. Golden, with regard to this particular wound, we have the complete severing of both carotid arteries, is that correct?
Yes.
And you have the near severing of one jugular vein and a nick in the other jugular vein, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, doctor, did you form an opinion as to whether or not this particular wound, in and of itself, was a fatal wound?
Yes.
And what was your opinion?
This is a fatal wound.
And why, sir? Please explain.
Well, both the carotid arteries and the common carotid arteries and the internal jugular veins were transected and cut, which would lead to exsanguinating hemorrhage.
And what does exsanguinating mean?
Bleeding out.
Which ultimately would cause death, would it not?
Yes.
Doctor, referring to the diagram which has been marked as People's 25 for identification and the figure in the lower right-hand corner, do you see that, sir?
25?
It's People's 25 to the side of the witness stand, sir.
Mr. Hodgman, I think this is probably an appropriate time to take a 15-minute recess.
Very well. Let's see.
Dr. Golden, who is the Deputy County Medical Examiner of the County Coroner's Office, has just given us, in typical coroner style, a very dry but at the same time compelling and riveting description of the nature of the wounds that Nicole Simpson received. And we heard him describe here at the conclusion of his testimony before this mid-morning break that, in fact, that wound itself would have been fatal. It was a particularly brutal wound. It went all the way across her neck up to her right earlobe, and it reached all the way back to the spinal column. This came after we heard as well from a Los Angeles Police Department criminalist this morning, Gregory Matheson, that the blood at the scene of the crime that he examined, one droplet of that blood, could not have been Nicole Simpson's blood or Ron Gold.
Or makes reference to 4 stab wounds to the left side of the neck. Is that correct?
Yes.
And with regard to your diagram, those wounds are numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. Is that correct?
Yes.
And wound number 2 appears to be less visible than the wounds that have been numbered 1, 3, and 4. Is that right?
Yes.
And doctor, with regard to those wounds, these numbers are for reference purposes only, are they not?
Yes.
They do not necessarily indicate the order of the wounds, do they?
That's correct.
Doctor, I'd like to have you briefly describe the wounds depicted on the diagram, starting with wound number 1, as you have so referred to it.
Okay. That is wound number 1. Yeah, and I'm also referring to the report also helped me refresh my memory. They are on the left side of the neck over the sternocleidomastoid muscle and extending from 3 inches below the external auditory canal. And I have number 1. Then number 2 is not that visible here, but I have the number and my notes about it, and my measurements here. Then there's number 3, left side of the neck, diagonally oriented, and then left side of the neck. The 4th one, the lowest down, is diagonally oriented. So that comprises the 4 stab wounds we're referring to.
And doctor, with regard to stab wound number 1, as we are referring to them, that wound was approximately 5/8 inches in length, was it not?
Yes.
And that is reflected in your autopsy report, is it not?
Yes, 5/8 inch in length.
Would you tell us a little bit about what you observed with regard to the nature of the wound to the skin?
Well, I made measurements of these wounds. All the measurements are made after I personally inspect the wounds and approximate and realign the edges to make them conform more with their appearance as a stab wound, because stab wounds such as these gape at the center, and the only way to get an estimation or an approximation of the true length of the wound is to align the edges by twisting the skin or pushing the skin into alignment. So all my measurements are made that way. And then I observe the configuration. This wound had this 5/8 inch wound, which was vertically oriented, had a blunt end inferiorly and a pointed end superiorly, which means it had it had the shape of a very narrow triangle, and the blunt end was in the lower part, and then it came to a pointed end above.
And what was the depth of penetration for this particular wound?
The depth of penetration is approximate because this wound, number 1, as well as number 3 and 4, were within 1.5 inches of the cutting wound that was on the left side of the neck, and these wounds shared common areas of injury with the others. So the exact depth could not be determined with any degree of precision.
And when you refer to the cutting wound, you're referring to the wound you've described earlier in your testimony and as depicted in the upper left-hand corner of the diagram, People's 25. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm referring to that incised or cutting wound of the neck.
Now, Doctor, with regard to stab wound number 2, as you've indicated in your autopsy report, that was a superficial slit-like incision approximately 1/8 inches in length. Is that correct?
Yes.
With regard to stab wound number 3, also located on the left side of the neck, was that approximately a 1/2 inch in length?
Yes, that was a 1/2 inch in length, diagonally oriented wound just below number 1 on the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It had a blunt end as well as a pointed end, similar to number 1, and again this wound going through the skin and into the tissue beneath the skin shared a common area of injury. You could say it intersected or crossed paths or planes with the incised wound of the neck. So the depth of penetration is approximate.
And you approximated it at approximately 1.5 to 2 inches. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be maximal. Yes.
And with regard to stab wound number 4, as indicated on your diagram, sir, also located on the left side of the neck.
Yes, that was the lowest of the group. That was 7/8 of an inch in length. Again, a blunt end or squared off end, 1/32 of an inch, and a pointed end at the opposite side. Again, 1-1.5 inches of maximal penetration into the neck.
Doctor, with regard to these wounds we've characterized as 1, 2, and 3, and 4, were any of them consistent with having been inflicted by a single-edged knife?
Yes.
Which ones?
1, 3, and 4.
And why is that, sir?
Because of the configuration. A single-edged knife or knife blade will have a dull end. Correction. A single-edged blade will have a sharp edge and a dull edge. And a stab wound corresponding to that knife will have a blunt end and a pointed end.
Such as
and that's what I found on those 3 wounds.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Golden, would you define for us and as well as explain the distinction between antemortem and perimortem?
Well,
what does antemortem mean?
Well, antemortem means before death, and that refers to injuries that occur before death while the person is alive, and that there would be obviously vital activity.
And what do you mean by vital activity?
Well, blood pressure, particularly blood pressure in the vessels where an injury might occur. That's why we're concerned with vital activity where injuries might occur during life or after death.
And what does perimortem mean?
Perimortem means about the time of death, shortly before, at the time of death, or shortly after.
Dr. Golden, with regard to stab wounds 1, 2, 3, and 4, as indicated on People's 25 for identification, would you characterize those as antemortem wounds?
Yes.
And did you observe, in connection with each of those wounds, some sort of vital activity, as you've described it, which would cause you to determine that they are antemortem?
Yes, all of these injuries had bleeding, either at the margins or in the tissue spaces along the wound path.
Doctor,
I might say, incidentally, when I describe wounds or forensic pathologists describe wounds, we may say that we may describe injuries and specify where injuries appear to be post-mortem. I mean, that's characteristic. If we find a wound that appears to be inflicted post-mortem, we would specifically state that. And contrary to that, when we see vital activity, we generally describe bleeding in the wound or in the wound path or in the tissue spaces along the wound to substantiate that they occurred during life.
Dr. Golden, with regard to the figure in the lower left-hand portion of the diagram marked as People's 25 for identification, does that figure indicate some sort of wound or trauma to the right side of Nicole Brown Simpson's head?
If we're referring to the red marking here, yes.
And what did you find during the course of your autopsy that indicated such a wound or trauma?
Well, I'm referring to my report to refresh memory, but there was a bruise on the right side of the scalp, 4 inches directly above the ear canal. And after shaving of the scalp, it was 1 by 1 inch. It was a fresh bruise. It was red-violet in color. No other injury was apparent, meaning no abrasion or laceration. And this bruise, on subsequent examination, disclosed bruising beneath the scalp. Correction on that, fresh bruising beneath the scalp.
Would that indicate to you, sir, that this was an antemortem wound?
Yes, this was an antemortem wound. It was associated with a deep scalp bruise.
Inflicted, consequently, while Nicole Brown Simpson was still alive. Is that correct?
Yes.
And inferentially, before she received the gaping incised wound across the neck. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have another diagram that I would like to have marked. It pertains to the autopsy of Nicole Brown Simpson. It reflects the 3 wounds to the scalp. May this be People's 26 for identification?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, during the course of your autopsy upon the body of Nicole Brown Simpson, did you observe wounds or trauma to the scalp of Nicole?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us what you observed, sir.
There was a cutting wound on the back of the scalp left side, which, and I'm referring to my report, particularly the addendum report on Nicole Brown Simpson. It's a 1 1/4 inch length, diagonally oriented cutting wound, tapered above, and this doesn't reflect it as well. The diagram doesn't reflect the actual appearance as the photograph would, but it's a 1 1/4 inch long cutting wound. It was longer than deep. It went into the scalp for approximately 3/8 to 1/2 inch and did no further damage to the skull.
This was not a fatal wound, I take it?
No.
Was it an antemortem wound, that is, one that was inflicted before Nicole Brown Simpson died?
Yes, this wound was associated with fresh scalp hemorrhage. In other words, bleeding in the deep scalp tissues.
Now, Dr. Golden, there were 2 other wounds that you observed with regard to Nicole Brown Simpson's scalp. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
There was a cutting wound or stab wound superficially right in the posterior parietal occipital, in other words, lower down here on the right side of the lower scalp. This was a 1/2 inch in length superficial wound, only going in, again, 3/8 to 1/2 inch, a non-fatal wound.
Was it also
there was a small amount of hemorrhage associated. Again, that occurred before death. It was an antemortem injury.
Okay, thank you, doctor. And just for purposes of the record, you were indicating a wound roughly in the center of the head, midway between the ears on People's 26 for identification.
Yes.
Doctor, there was a 3rd wound. Would you briefly describe that wound for us and indicate whether or not it was antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem?
That was an antemortem cutting wound, 3/16 of an inch in length, involving the skin only, with a small amount of deep scalp hemorrhage. Again, it's antemortem, is a superficial cutting wound of the scalp.
And you're indicating on the diagram, People's 26 for identification, a wound closest to the left ear as depicted on the diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, doctor, during the course of your autopsy as performed upon Nicole Brown Simpson's body, did you notice any injuries to her hands?
Yes.
Tell us about that, sir.
Well, okay, referring to my notes, my autopsy notes and protocol to refresh my memory, on the index finger on the right index finger, there was a 5/8 inch long cut of the skin adjacent to the distal knuckle. Involved the skin only, and it was a tangential cut, which would indicate that it was shelved. In other words, it didn't go in straight. It was an oblique cut, which would indicate shelving or a tangential cut.
And so what is the distal knuckle?
The one closest to the fingertip. Proximal, distal. Proximal is closer to the... Proximal would be closer to the hand, and distal would be closer to the fingertip.
I see. Okay. Would you briefly describe the other wounds to Nicole Brown Simpson's hands that you observed?
2 minor injuries. Punctate abrasion on the ring finger of the right hand, on the left hand, punctate abrasion, base of the right ring finger, and finally there was a 1/2 inch superficial skin cut on the top of the left hand.
Dr. Golden, are you familiar with the term defense wounds?
Yes.
What are defense wounds, sir?
Of the thigh with bleeding along the wound path. The depth of penetration was approximately
your testimony, sir, I would infer that this was a wound that you would characterize as antemortem. Is that
Yes, there was bleeding along the
observed in connection with this particular wound? Would you characterize this wound as one consistent with having been inflicted by a single-edged knife?
Now, this wound did have the characteristic rounded or dull end that would be characteristic of a single-edged blade. Yes, it would.
Doctor, during the course of the autopsy involving Mr. Goldman's body, you detected a wound to the left side abdomen of Mr. Goldman, did you not?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have here one last diagram depicting the described wound to the left side abdomen of Mr. Goldman. May this be 31 for identification?
Yes.
Doctor, with reference to the wound as depicted in the rightmost figure on this diagram of People's 31 for identification, would you describe that wound for us, please?
Okay, and I'm referring to my report to refresh my recollection. It was a stab wound of the left flank below the rib cage, and it was 3/4 of an inch in length. This wound did not have a blunt or squared off end. It was, one end was pointed or tapered, the opposite end was forked or split. And then going through this wound penetrated into the body wall and passed through the muscle, the iliopsoas muscle, with bleeding along the way, and then going from back to front, the wound ended in the abdominal aorta, where two perforating stab wounds were evident. So the wound terminated in the abdominal aorta with two perforating wounds.
In other words, the abdominal aorta was perforated, is that correct?
Yes.
What was the apparent depth of the wound?
Measured from the outside of the body wall to the termination in the aorta was approximately 5.5 inches.
Was this wound fatal in and of itself?
Yes, this perforated the aorta. There was hemorrhage along the wound path, and there was bleeding inside the body cavity, the peritoneal cavity.
Doctor, not depicted on any diagram identified thus far, was there a stab wound to the upper right chest over the right clavicle? Do you recall that one?
Yes, yes. It's not on this diagram. It's in my report.
And that was a superficial wound?
A superficially oriented wound, 1/2 inch in length, involving the skin, the subcutaneous tissue. Again, it was split or forked on one end, pointed or tapered on the other end, with a small amount of hemorrhage. Again, cannot tell from this wound whether it was caused by a single or double-edged
You
blade.
were able to determine, were you not, that this was an antemortem wound?
Yes, there was a small amount of fresh bleeding associated, so it was an antemortem wound.
Dr. Golden, earlier in your testimony today, you have described for us what are known as defense wounds. Did you see any indicia of defense wounds on Mr. Goldman's body?
Yes.
in general, would you describe what you observed in that regard?
He had cutting wounds on the right hand and on the left hand. And specifically, there were cutting wounds on the palm of the right hand, at the base of the index finger, palmar surface of the right hand, at the web of the thumb, palmar surface of the right hand, near the web of the thumb, palmar surface of the left hand, at the web of the thumb, and on the addendum report, specifically on the palmar surface of the left hand, there was a superficial cutting wound. So I believe that characterizes the main sharp force or cutting injuries on his hands.
I have here two photographs. People's 29 for identification with the court's permission depicts the...
I'm sorry, People's 29? We're up to
32.
31.
Yes. And that the photograph bears a coroner's tag and appears to depict the right palm of the decedent. And then People's 33 for identification, Your Honor, similar photograph depicting what appears to be the left palm of the decedent, Ronald Goldman. It too also bears a coroner's evidence tag, which corresponds to the case number assigned to Mr. Goldman's autopsy. May these be so marked for identification? Yes. Dr. Goldman, I'm going to hand you first People's 32 for identification and ask that you observe that in discrete fashion. Sir, does that photograph depict the sharper incised wounds that you've described in your testimony as defense wounds to the right palm of Mr. Goldman's hand?
Yes.
Was that a photo taken during Mr. Goldman's autopsy?
Yes.
With regard to People's 33 for identification, would you tell us what that depicts, sir? That is the photograph that is now face down on the witness stand before you. What does that photograph depict, sir?
That is the left hand of the decedent, palmar surface.
Does that photograph truly and accurately depict the defense wounds to the left palm of Mr. Goldman's hands that you've described thus far in your testimony?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, in addition to the wounds depicted in People's 32 and 33 for identification, did you observe what might be characterized as other defense wounds to the back of Mr. Goldman's hands as well as to his forearms?
Yes.
And in general and in brief, how would you characterize those wounds?
Basically, there are multiple abrasions involving the forearm, including the outer or lateral aspect of the forearm where there are multiple abrasions. That means scratches. Some were not scratches. They were irregular in configuration. On the top of the hand, there were fresh bruises, abrasions on the knuckles, and I went into detail on which fingers and which knuckles there are abrasions, bruises on the various knuckles and fingers of the right hand. On the top or dorsal surface of the left hand, there were multiple red-brown abrasions involving the knuckles of the index finger, and then there were also multiple irregularly configured abrasions on the knuckle of the middle finger. There was also a fresh bruise, about 1 1/4 by 1 1/2 inches on the top of the left hand, adjacent to the wrist. And fresh bruises on the ulnar surface of the left wrist, which means on the, I guess you'd say, the inner surface of the left wrist. And on the addendum report, there were a few additional abrasions on the fingers, the fingers of the left hand, middle finger, left hand, fifth finger, and on the distal portion of the left thumb. So basically, there were a number of abrasions and bruises, many on the top or knuckles of the fingers and on the top of the hand.
All compatible with defense wounds, in your opinion?
Well, yes, or arising during a struggle.
Dr. Golden, at the conclusion of your autopsy, did you form an opinion as to the cause of Ronald Goldman's death?
Yes.
And what was your opinion?
He died as a result of the multiple sharp injuries, which included the cutting wound of the left side of the neck, which severed or transected the left internal jugular vein, and the two stab wounds of the right side of the chest, which perforated the thorax and right lung, and the stab wound of the left side of the abdomen, which perforated the abdominal aorta.
A few more questions, sir, if I may.
Yes.
Dr. Golden, during each of these autopsies, were the investigating officers from the Los Angeles Police Department present?
Yes.
And by that I mean specifically, were Detectives Phil Van Adder and Tom Lang present during each of the autopsies?
Yes.
Sir, with regard to the autopsy performed on Nicole Brown Simpson's body, did you take a blood sample for purposes of serological study?
Yes.
And was that particular blood sample placed in a test tube bearing Nicole Brown Simpson's name and the applicable coroner's case number?
Yes.
Was the same procedure followed with regard to the taking of a blood sample from Ronald Goldman's body?
Yes.
And were those blood samples later delivered into the custody of Detective Van Adder?
Yes.
Dr. Golden, on June the 15th, 1994, were you visited at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office by Detective Phil Van Adder?
Yes.
On that date, sir, did Detective Van Adder show you a knife?
Yes.
Describe what you recall about the knife that was shown to you by Detective Van Adder.
It was a folding knife with a blade approximately 6 inches long.
And describe what happened when Detective Van Adder showed you that knife.
Well, he wanted to know if that knife was consistent or compatible with the wounds that I saw inflicted on either individual, and whether it was compatible with some of the wounds inflicted on either individual.
And did you provide Detective Van Adder with an answer?
I said it could. Yes, I did.
And what was your answer?
I said it could have been the weapon. Yes, that inflicted some of the wounds.
Now, you examined the knife. Is that correct?
Cursorily, yes. I measured the length of and the width of the blade.
Now, is your opinion that a knife such as that could have inflicted the wounds received by Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman definitive, or would you have liked to have done something more with regard to examination of the knife to determine more precisely?
It was not definitive. I'd like to do a lot more.
Like what?
Well, make detailed measurements of the blade, correlating each wound that I described, specifically each stab wound that I described in my protocol, with measurements of the blade of the instrument.
To date, sir, have you had the opportunity to conduct such an examination?
No, I haven't.
So your opinion then is, with regard to the knife displayed to you by Detective Van Ander, that it could have inflicted the wounds upon Mr. Goldman's body and upon Nicole Brown Simpson's body, but not necessarily so. Is that correct?
Not necessarily so. To be scientific, I would have to get my little white ruler out that I use for measuring the wounds on the body and do the same thing on the knife.
Okay. May I have a moment, John?
Yes.
No further questions.
It's about 5 minutes to 12. Which of you is going to cross-examine the witness? Okay. I think we'll break at this point. We'll start with your cross-examination at 1:30. I would like to see counsel briefly in chambers.
At 4 minutes before noon in Los Angeles, just a little before 3 o'clock in New York City, the end of the direct testimony from the medical examiner, the coroner, in which he says she, Nicole Brown Simpson, died as a result of sharp force injuries, and he died as a result of multiple sharp injuries. We're going to take a break as well in a couple of minutes from now, and
I don't know whether he did. That's the foundation that has not been established.
Well, I believe, Your Honor, he has testified that an eyewitness to, or somebody establishing the time the decedent was last known alive, would be one of 6 factors he would consider in establishing time of death.
I understand that, but specifically in this case, there's been no testimony that he in fact did rely upon any statement from someone indicating that they had had a telephone conversation with the decedent. And that's what you need to establish before I'll allow that testimony, and for a limited purpose only, not for the truth of the matter.
If you had some information as to the time the decedent was last talking to her mother, would that be of any benefit to you in coming to your estimate as to the time of death?
No, my estimates are based on the body measurements. I did not use any information about a telephone conversation.
Did you see any information about a telephone conversation when you came to your conclusions?
I heard about a telephone conversation and did see it in the report.
Who'd you hear about it from?
The initial report of the telephone conversation?
Yes.
I believe I heard it on the news or in the paper.
Is that before you saw it in your report?
Yes.
You mean the news had it on before it was in your investigator's report on the 13th?
I believe the news used the investigator's report. Preliminary investigator's report.
Are you saying the news read the report before you did?
Oh, no, I'm not saying that at all.
My question now is...
All I'm saying is I did not use any telephone conversation to come to this time of death determination. I'm using body measurements and rigor mortis, livor mortis, cooling of the body, and gastric contents. That has nothing to do with a telephone conversation.
That's 10.5 hours after the fact. And you would rather rely upon that than upon a mother's testimony that she talked, or a mother's comment that she had a telephone conversation with her daughter? You think, which one do you think is more accurate?
Your Honor, death's compound.
Among other things, sustained.
Okay, we'll go on to something. We'll go on to something else. Do you have an opinion? You observed the stomach contents of the decedent, Mr. Goldman. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you save those?
Yes.
Why'd you save his and not save hers?
Save the contents on Nicole Brown Simpson. It was important to measure it, characterize it, describe it, and I did not think it was indicated to save it for toxicological examination. Of course, saving blood and other body fluids was very important for toxicological examination, which is what we did. The duty to characterize the gastric contents and measure it and describe what was in it was important, which is what I did. On Mr. Goldman, again, blood and other body fluids were preserved. On him, I was asked to save the gastric contents.
Who asked you to do that?
My chief supervisor, Dr. Lakshmanan.
Do you have an opinion as to, between Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman, who was the last one to consume food?
I have no opinion on that, no.
Did you form any conclusion or opinion as to whose food was more digested in the stomach?
Mr. Goldman's food was more digested than Nicole Brown Simpson's.
If he ate after she did, would that mean that he lived longer than she did?
If he had a meal after she had a meal?
Yes.
Does this indicate that he lived longer than she did?
Yes.
Well, I don't know for sure. His state of the food being more digested in his stomach could indicate that he had the meal earlier, or that he had a lighter meal, and that digestion started sooner, whereas her food being in a less digested state, particularly what I observed, a lot of the food appeared to be unchewed, particularly some of the particles of rigatoni were unchewed, and that could indicate that the unchewed food could remain in the stomach for a longer period of time before digestion.
Regarding the knife wounds, is it your findings that there were two types of knife wounds on both victims?
There are two morphologically different types of stab wounds on the victims. Namely, some of the stab wounds on the victims are indicative of a single-edged blade for the reasons that I indicated. They have both a round or blunt end and a pointed end. And some of the wounds have a characteristically double-pointed or forked end, which would indicate that they could be made by either a blunt end instrument or knife or a double sharp end instrument. In other words, a two-edged knife or a single-edged knife. And there's no way that my determinations can tell the difference between those. So there are two morphologically different types.
Could two knives have produced the injuries on both of the victims?
Yes.
Was there any evidence of any sexual attack on the decedent, Nicole Brown?
No, there wasn't.
Did you look for any semen, saliva, hairs, bloods that might be left behind on the victim of a sexual attack?
Okay, that would be performed by a criminalist to collect and preserve that evidence, and I wouldn't do it, and it's my understanding that it was not requested or performed.
Was there any attempt made to look for semen in Nicole or Mr. Goldman at the scene or at the autopsy?
Not to my knowledge.
Is it proper, in your opinion, to do a rape kit analysis on young women murder victims as a general rule?
The circumstances would dictate whether that procedure would be performed, and the investigators are the ones who would initiate that request.
Detective Van Adder brought you a knife to examine.
Yes, he did.
When was that?
Wednesday, so that would be Wednesday, June 15th.
Was he alone when he brought that to you?
Yes.
Where were you when you received that knife?
I was in my office at the coroner's office.
Did he give you a chance to examine the knife?
Briefly.
Did you ask him, did you tell him you might have needed, did you need more time than he gave you to examine it?
For an accurate scientific examination, yes.
Did you tell him that?
No.
Why not?
I didn't think it was indicated.
Wait, a detective who's in charge of a homicide comes in with a knife, and he tells you this may be similar to the murder weapon. Is that correct?
Yes.
He asks you to check to see, and you're telling us that you didn't think it was indicated for you to perform a proper evaluation?
Well, I said it could be the weapon that caused some of the wounds, including the cutting wounds. It was a single-edged, it had a single sharp cutting edge, and it's obviously consistent with many of the slashing wounds. And it was a 6-inch blade. And at the time, we didn't think it indicated, or I didn't think it indicated to go through each wound by wound, just to try to exclude that weapon. That can be done at some other time.
You understand a man is sitting in jail faced with charges of double homicide, do you not?
Yes.
Well, when could that be done to protect his rights?
Objection on our argument.
Sustained.
When would you suggest doing that to protect his rights?
Same objection.
Sustained is the form of the question.
When would you suggest doing these tests?
Now?
I have nothing further.
Mr. Hodgman?
If I may, just a moment.
I want to bring in Dr. Cyril Wecht again, our pathologist. What's going on here, Dr. Wecht? And how well is defense counsel doing in at least embarrassing the coroner, if he is at all?
I think defense counsel has done an excellent job in embarrassing the witness. I must say, and this is not a ad hominem attack on Dr. Golden, but what we have witnessed is a very, very terrible presentation of forensic pathology testimony. I'd like to comment more on that later, Peter, if there's time.
Thanks.
Yes.
And there is not a way, even based upon the criteria articulated in court this afternoon, for you to pinpoint a time of death. Is that correct?
Yes.
The best you can do is give us a range of time in which time of death might have occurred. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that is an approximation at best, is it not?
Yes.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Mr. Shapiro, anything further? Thank you, Doctor. You may step down. Please do not discuss your testimony with anyone but the attorneys involved.
Dr. Weck, Peter Jennings again. A terrible presentation of forensic philosophy, you say. Explain that.
Well, philosophy is your word, but I'm glad you used it because it is a very appropriate word here. Philosophy, procedure. And what we have also witnessed, Peter, I think that is more disturbing to me, and I use this word advisedly, quite reprehensible from the district attorney's standpoint, is a denigration of the practice of forensic pathology as they have it in their own county from the medical examiner's office. Can you imagine what Leslie Abramson and every other attorney in criminal cases, and indeed in civil cases who deal occasionally with times of death, will do with the transcript of this testimony?
No, you tell me what they're going to do. Tell me in layman's four-letter words what he did wrong.
Well, in any future case, when an attorney is challenging a time of death, be it murder or malpractice or products liability or automobile accident or personal injury, and the medical examiner from the medical examiner coroner's office is there, they're going to bring out this transcript, and they're going to take the words of Dr. Golden and of the DA.
Stand by, would you please?
All right. That would be defense A, B, C, D. The court did not allow E, G, or H. So are you seeking to offer only A, B, C, D, and
They decided
F
to rest their case, which means the
Any
prosecution
objection?
has done what it wanted to
Those items are
do.
received from the defense. Do you have any motions at this time?
Before we begin considering an affirmative defense, there would be a motion to dismiss the case.
I'm sorry, you say before you begin considering an affirmative
I think at
defense?
this point in time, we would like to make a motion to have this case dismissed.
That motion is denied. Do you wish to present an affirmative defense? Yes.
Cynthia McFadden, this question of affirmative defense came up at the very beginning of the preliminary hearing. What might it be if they decide to mount it?
Well, the question is, Peter, whether or not they're going to put on some evidence of their own. Typically, affirmative defenses mean that the individual admits having committed a crime and then affirmatively defends, saying, this is why I did it. I don't think in this context that's what it's going to mean. It will mean whether or not the defense chooses to put on some affirmative explanation, some alibi explanation, perhaps. But I must say, I couldn't hear, maybe somebody else could, I couldn't hear what the original motion was. Did you catch it?
Yes, I believe it was a motion to dismiss the case, and I believe it was denied.
You have better ears than I do.
But denied rather quickly there, which means that, which suggests at least that Judge Kennedy Powell has already made up her mind about what the disposition of this preliminary hearing is?
Well, maybe that's what it means. I think a motion to dismiss is probably not going to be accepted in a circumstance like this. She is certainly going to consider it on the merits. A motion to dismiss, if granted, would mean there's no grounds upon which to consider this at all, and I don't think that's the situation.
Okay, I'm going to come back to Dr. Wecht in just a minute in terms of his analysis of the forensic presentation made by the Deputy Commissioner there. But I want to go first to Robert Filibosian and then to Leslie Abramson to just get your impressions of what has happened in the last several hours.
Well, over the last several hours, we saw the really conclusion of the prosecution's case on probable cause, particularly the blood testimony, which we believe was rather abbreviated, but probably because they believe they have enough, and I believe they have enough. The questioning of the coroner is of some concern, and Mr. Shapiro did set up the coroner for some rather troublesome cross-examination at trial, assuming that there is a trial, and we are making that assumption. I think the coroner is going to go back. He's going to do the examination of the knife and the comparison. He's going to do some more thinking about his testimony, and I think he's going to be a lot better prepared when this case goes to trial.
Leslie Abramson, there was this question of addendum. Dr. Wecht referred to it, and so did some others, as to, it sounds a little bit like he's rewriting the coroner's report. Is that correct?
Well, it sounds like he's trying to give more detail, but I tell you that this sloppiness, this late investigating, this unpreparedness by this coroner's office is totally unsurprising. I have had circumstantial evidence cases where the absolutely critical issue was time of death, and they never even took a liver temperature. Why? Because they broke their thermometer 6 months before, and the county hadn't replaced it yet, and it cost $3.25, and that is forensic pathology in Los Angeles County. It is a scandal.
In fairness, I think we should probably, unless I'm wrong, we should point out that Dr. Golden testified in the Menendez trial where you defended one of the brothers, right?
And he did a very good job in the Menendez trial, as a matter of fact. We spent a great deal of time with him. We would have called him if the prosecution had not. A time of death wasn't an issue there. These kinds of pinning down of details in order to establish circumstantial evidence facts were not an issue there. But actually, he was a very good witness in that case. One of the problems is that they have a huge number of cases, and the prosecutors don't adequately prepare them for testimony. But their failure is their investigators' failure, by and large. They don't take the measurements. They don't take the temperature. They don't roll to the scenes as soon as bodies are disclosed. And then they try to do this patch-up estimate of time of death later when people's lives hang on this kind of information and when the solving of serious crimes hang on it. They are very bad about that.
Well, those of us who watch this with far less sophisticated eyes than all of you have, I think, the following impression, that there is a window of opportunity during which Mr. Simpson's whereabouts were not accounted for. Therefore, if you could prove that this crime was committed outside the window of opportunity, it might go better for him. Not having the time of death makes it better for him?
No, it just means it's much harder to, well, first of all, it eliminates his opportunity to use time of death as an explanation that would show that he didn't commit these crimes. The sloppiness of the coroner's investigation keeps that all vague. And I suspect somewhere in my heart of hearts that that's one of the reasons this coroner's office tends to be sloppy and vague about time of death. I don't think the police agencies want them to be specific.
Let me bring in Peter. Sorry, you weren't quite finished.
It's all right. You got, I think I made the point.
Let me bring in Peter Aronella from UCLA. If you were the defense counsel in this case, would you be leaping on the testimony of the coroner for use at a subsequent trial? And do you think it would be of great value to you?
Absolutely. I mean, this was really quite shocking testimony, as I'm sure your forensic expert will elaborate on, but just a couple of specific criteria here. One of the factors in assessing time of death is
evidence
that you wish to make
be presented by the defense.
With regard to any motions.
Yes, Your Honor, I would like to be heard on a motion to dismiss.
I'll hear you this time.
Thank you. Would you like me to go to the podium or stand here?
I think the podium is probably better.
Your Honor, I would ask the court to consider the jury instruction that would be given in a case like this regarding circumstantial evidence. And that is, if the evidence presented relies solely on circumstantial evidence, there can be no conviction unless the circumstances point to guilt and are not reconcilable with any other reasonable theory. If, on the other hand, the circumstances may point to guilt or may point to innocence, the jury or finder of fact must adopt that theory which points to innocence and reject that which points to guilt. Now, clearly, this is not a trial. And clearly, the burden is not the same. But the legal principle remains. This is a case based entirely on circumstantial evidence. And it is clear from the presentation of the people and through our cross-examination that the circumstances can point both towards a suspicion of guilt and also towards a theory of innocence. The key piece of evidence that the people are relying on is the serology of a 99% chance that 4 blood drops found at the Bundy crime scene were of the same type and chemical composition as that of Mr. O.J. Simpson.
Objection, that's a misstatement of the evidence.
This is argument, Ms. Clark. You can be heard in response at the appropriate time.
The converse of that is that if you take the Coliseum on any given Sunday, 40,000 to 80,000 people will have that same blood type. Number 2, there was testimony elicited from the people's witness that Mr. Simpson has joint custody of these children with his ex-wife, the decedent, Nicole. That being the case, it is reasonable to assume that he would visit the children or pick them up at her condominium on a regular basis. Since the criminalist cannot fix the age of the blood spots, there is an equally reasonable theory that those blood spots, if in fact they belong to Mr. Simpson, were placed there at some other time than at the time of death. And in fact, the criminalist testified that by viewing the photographs, the blood appeared to be of different ages. However, he blamed that on poor photography. But on cross-examination, he admitted that proper crime scene photography requires using the same type of equipment with the same lighting conditions from the same angle. Point number 2 that the prosecution relies on. There is a matching glove found in the debris behind the Simpson residence that matches a glove found at the crime scene. Let's go by the testimony. I asked Deputy Van Adder, how did that glove get there? He said, someone brought it there. Let's look at the other circumstantial evidence involved. If, in fact, the killer lived at the Simpson residence, the court would have to believe the following: that in a window period of less than an hour, the killer was able to leave the crime scene that has been described with a victim with 2 arteries in the neck cut, 2 jugular veins cut, and massive blood from both victims. A clear inference would be that the murderer was indeed covered with blood. The murderer would then have to do the following: abandon the bloody clothing, because they have not been found or presented, abandon the murder weapon, because that has not been found or discovered, abandon bloody shoes, because they have not been found or discovered, and then go back to his house and leave a bloody glove in his backyard. That just doesn't stand up to logic. We have no evidence whatsoever in this record that whoever committed this horrendous act acted with premeditation and deliberation, as is charged in the complaint filed by the district attorney. This is a case that the police admit is still under investigation, where other suspects are being sought, where the medical examiner admits that 2 weapons could have been used. A clear inference that there may be more than one killer. I don't want to go through each and every area of impeachment with the witnesses, but I think it is very, very clear that everybody who has participated in this investigation has not done so in a professional manner. From the time the Los Angeles Police Department arrived on the crime scene, it was nearly 10 hours later until they started the scientific investigation and even took the temperature of the body. There was testimony that the fire department obviously was there and left and didn't do anything, yet the coroner's records clearly indicate that the fire department chief was the person who pronounced the body's dead. I doubt if he did that from a distance. This is a case that everybody has jumped to an immediate and unrealistic conclusion as to the state of this evidence. This is a case that is not ready yet to come to court. This is a case where the chief serologist said we use serology as much to eliminate as to implicate, and yet we have no DNA testing back. This is a case that is needless and groundless and does not warrant any further consideration at this point in time. The court, on viewing all of the evidence, that has been presented from the witness stand should have little difficulty in deciding that this certainly is not a case of any premeditated murder by anyone, for there is totally no evidence on that issue whatsoever. And number two, that there is not and cannot be at this point in time a strong suspicion that Mr. Simpson is guilty of anything. Therefore, Your Honor, it is incumbent upon you to exercise your duties under the law and dismiss this case.
Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Your Honor. In order to find in this case, Your Honor, that there is no strong suspicion to believe the defendant has committed the crimes that he is charged with, you would have to ignore all of the evidence. And the evidence is consistent and very powerful, even at this early stage of the case, to indicate that the defendant has indeed committed every crime that he is charged with. As I'm sure this court is aware, there need be no finding with respect to the degree of the murders charged at this time. I will address the issue of the sufficiency of the evidence to prove premeditation, however, if the court desires. But I will leave that for now unless and until the court asks me to address that issue, because I do think the evidence is clearly sufficient to show that these crimes were premeditated murders. With respect to the issue of circumstantial evidence, as usual, as is typical, counsel picks one part away and says, that's not enough, and takes another part away and says, that's not enough. And of course, if you pick apart any case, any one bit, singly, may not be enough to prove the entire case, nor should it be, because circumstantial evidence, being one of the stronger ways to prove guilt, requires a number of pieces of evidence to amount to proof that will prove the defendant committed the crimes charged. This case is no exception. Rather than relying on the testimony of an eyewitness who may be mistaken, who may be under stress, seeing a defendant flee from a scene perhaps with poor lighting, never having seen that person before, and glimpsing them for a split second, that's direct evidence. But as the court knows, a fingerprint is circumstantial evidence. A circumstantial evidence in that way is very, very reliable and is much stronger because it does rely on many factors for its proof rather than one single one. This is a physical evidence case, and the physical evidence and the inferences to be drawn therefrom are powerful. First of all, the killer in this case was clearly injured during the commission of these murders. He left a trail of blood leading away from the victims to the rear of the residence and out to the alley. A trail of blood was found from the defendant's Ford Bronco leading up the driveway to his front door. And I would remind the court that the distance between the two locations is a mere 2 miles approximately. Certainly not enough time for whatever injury was sustained at the time of the attack to have healed sufficiently so that he would not bleed, unless he was holding something in his hands that would stop the blood. Now, the fact that we failed to find the bloody shoes that clearly were worn from the scene, although we did find a bloody glove, is hardly illogical at all. The reason we found the bloody glove was simply accident, the defendant's misfortune. It was clearly his intent. At the time the thumps were heard by Cato, he was back there trying to hide things or look for a place to secrete them and dropped the glove inadvertently. Had he known he dropped the glove, obviously we would never have found that either. But that was not the case. He did drop the glove, not intentionally, but by accident. Secondly, the bloody glove that was found at the crime scene is left-handed. That's a very important fact. The bloody shoe prints leaving that crime scene with blood drops alongside them were to the left of those shoe prints. That shows us that the killer was injured somewhere on his left side. The blood on the driver's door handle of the Ford Bronco would logically be opened with the left hand. And it's no coincidence that we just happened to find the blood spot on the driver's door handle. And now I know that the testimony to this time, Your Honor, has indicated that it was positive as an indication of blood, but not tested to be human or animal. But the last time I checked, dogs don't drive cars, and at least not Ford Broncos, and I think we can draw a reasonable inference that it was a human who left the blood on the door handle of a car. And those reasonable inferences are precisely what the court is required to draw from all of the evidence, the reasonable inferences. Now, on the day that the defendant returned from Chicago, Detective Van Adder makes the observation that after having seen the left-handed bloody glove left at the crime scene, that clearly came off during the struggle, which is what allowed him to get the cut that left the blood drops to the left of the footprints and left us the blood drops on the driver's handle door, he sees the defendant with a bandage around his middle left finger. And then he takes him down to Parker Center, where he sees again that he has, and we've shown the picture to the court, a swollen finger on the left hand with a cut that was dressed and treated at Parker Center. No coincidence. Third, the right-handed mate to that glove is found on the defendant's property at, I think it was mere hours after the crimes were committed, in a dark, narrow area, obviously where there was some clandestine activity designed to hide evidence, during which time it was inadvertently dropped. And that discovery was made after Cato Kalin indicated he heard the 3 thumps against the wall. Someone fell against that wall, and that someone was the defendant. And in that process, lost the right-handed glove. And a presumptive test on that glove for blood came up positive. Fourth, the defendant clearly lied to the limousine driver, Alan Park. When Alan Park drove down to the Rockingham gate at about 10:40, the Ford Bronco was not there. Between 10:40 and 10:55, he rang the intercom repeatedly, and he received no answer. It was only when 15 minutes later, after Park had just seen a black person 6 feet, 200 pounds, walk quickly up the drive and into the front door, that the intercom was finally answered by the defendant. Before that person, 6 feet, 200 pounds, entered the house through a front door that Cato said was kept locked, all downstairs lights were off. Immediately after that person entered the house, all the lights went on. And 30 seconds later, the defendant answered the intercom where previously he had failed to do so. Now, it must be obvious to everyone at this point that the person seen entering the house by Alan Park was the defendant. But he lied to the limousine driver, and it's a very significant lie. Because why would he need to do that? Why not just say, I was out getting some last-minute things, I had to go shopping, I had to go to the store, I had to go get something from the 7-Eleven. He could have said anything. But it's very significant that he chose to lie to the limo driver at all, and the lie he chose to tell. What lie did he tell? He said, oh, I overslept. I just got out of the shower. We know that's not true. He was seen just going into the house 30 seconds before. The only reason to tell such a lie is that the defendant is trying to set up an alibi for the time when he knows the murders occurred. A very significant piece of evidence. Fifth, the blood drop on the trail leading away from the victims at 875 South Bundy. Testing revealed that only 43% of the population could have been the source of that blood drop.
Is that 43% or 0.43%?
0.43%, thank you, Your Honor, 0.43. Now, what's interesting is on cross-examination, counsel attempted to elicit the possibility that that stain might reflect that 2 people left that blood drop on the trail. If that's true, we do know this. At least one of them had all of the markers that can be attributed to the defendant, who is within 0.43% of the population that could have left that blood drop. And of the 43% of the population that could have been the source, the 0.43% that could have been the source of that blood drop, How many had a bloody glove found on their property mere hours after the murders occurred? A bloody glove that matched the bloody glove found at the crime scene, at the feet of one of the victims. That must considerably narrow down that figure. And so it's not just 99.57% of the population that is excluded, but virtually everyone but the defendant, when all of the evidence is taken into account, Your Honor. And in light of all of the evidence that we have presented, the people have more than established and carried their burden with respect to this preliminary hearing, and I submit that the defendant should be held to answer for all of the charges as charged in the complaint. Thank you.
All right, at this time, the court will take a 15-minute recess. I will announce my ruling at 3 o'clock.
2:45 in the afternoon. I'm sure it's clear to everybody around the country what is about to occur. Judge consulting both Marcia Clark, co-counsel for the prosecution, and Bob Shapiro, before making her decision on whether or not O.J. Simpson should be bound over to trial in a superior court for what we now know to be two clearly, astonishingly savage murders on the night of June the 12th. His wife and Ronald Goldman, who perhaps unfairly is often merely described as her friend. Miss Clark on the telephone, Mr. Shapiro to his seat. If he is bound over, as Cynthia McFadden and others have made clear to us, there is no opportunity for bail. There's no opportunity for bail in California on multiple murders, and he is charged with multiple murders. Leslie Averson, very quickly, I'm going to ask you to just keep your eye on the monitor there. If someone comes to you and says, I did it, what's your moral obligation?
You have no moral obligation whatsoever, except an ethical obligation.
Right,
if they tell you they did it, you can't put them on the witness stand to say they didn't.
Thank you.
Counsel, the people are represented. The court has carefully considered the evidence in this case and the arguments of counsel. And keeping in mind that the proof in this matter is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the court feels that there is ample evidence to establish strong suspicion of the guilt of the accused, and therefore the motion to dismiss is denied at this time. I want to make one comment with regard to the envelope, and that is this, that envelope at this time remains sealed, that the contents of that envelope, whatever they may be, in no way played a part in the proceeding or the decision in this matter, that envelope in a sealed condition will be transferred along with the court file to the Superior Court for such further rulings as are appropriate at a future point in time. Defendant, please stand. It appearing to me from the evidence presented that the following offenses have been committed, and there is sufficient cause to believe this defendant guilty of count 1, a violation of Penal Code Section 187A, with a special allegation pursuant to Penal Code Section 12022B, and count 2, a violation of Penal Code Section 187A, with a special allegation pursuant to Penal Code Section 12022B, and also that there's sufficient evidence of the special allegation pursuant to Penal Code Section 190.2A3. The court holds that the defendant be held to answer therefore, that there be no bail allowed in this case, and that the defendant be committed to the custody of the Sheriff of Los Angeles County. Date of arraignment in the Superior Court will be July the 22nd at 8:30 in Department 100. The defendant is remanded at this time, and this court is adjourned.
Of O.J. Simpson, who at his first arraignment, you will recall, was told later heavily sedated and did not even seem to know at the time where he was. cannot tell you much at the moment about what facilities they have made for those of us watching on television to hear or see, but let's listen.
Mr. Simpson, you are charged in information BA 97211 in count 1 with the crime of murder, and that it alleges that you did with malice of forethought murder Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being. You're charged in count 2 with the same charge. It alleges that you did with malice of forethought murder Ronald Lyle Goldman, a human being. Each of counts 1 and 2 contain a special allegation alleging the use of a dangerous or deadly weapon and knife, and there is a further special circumstance alleging a double homicide under 190.1A3 of the Penal Code. Do you understand the charges against you, sir?
Yes, Your Honor.
You've had an opportunity to discuss those charges with your attorneys?
Yes, Your Honor.
And are you ready to enter a plea at this time?
Yes, Your Honor.
How do you plead to counts 1 and 2?
Absolutely 100% not guilty.
And do you deny each of the special allegations and the special circumstance that is alleged?
Yes.
Thank you. Counsel, join?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may be seated. At this time, it is my intention to assign this case to a judge for all purposes. Should anticipate that the judge who's about to be named will be expected to try this case in its totality, and it is therefore within the legal meaning of that term an all-purpose assignment. I'm assigning the case to Judge Lance Ito. I wish to make a disclosure that I'd like to have your attention about. Judge Ito is married to a captain on the Los Angeles Police Department. She is assigned to the bunco forgery unit, and as is usual for Judge Ito in any case that involves the LAPD, he makes this disclosure, and in the event that either side desires him to do so, no affidavit will be required. On the request of either side, he will recuse himself from handling this matter. Are you in a position to state a position on that at this time, Mr. Shapiro, or would you wish to have a few minutes to confer with your colleagues?
Cynthia McFadden briefly confirmed for me there can be at least one challenge to a judge from the defense team and the prosecution, correct?
That's right, Peter. Each side has one free bite of the apple. Each side can object for any reason whatsoever before they get to the merits.
Is a choice that is acceptable to us, Your Honor.
Okay, Mr. Cochran, you joining that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Acceptable to the defense team?
People have a position they wish to express at this time, or do you need a few moments to confer with among yourselves or with others?
Thank you. Judge Ito will be acceptable to the people as well.
Very well, thank you. Then that is the assignment of the judge. The case will be tried in Department 103 on the 9th floor. There is a judge assigned to 103 who doesn't know that he has been dispossessed unless he happens to be watching television at the moment. What I am proposing to do is to set this matter for Department 103 for 1 week from today, Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning. There have been some motions filed that Judge Ito is familiar with. I anticipate there may be some others. Any motions that are ready to be filed today can be filed in Department 100, and we'll put them with the file, and he'll be ready on those on Friday. I am going to make a request of both sides that with respect to any motions that are filed from this day forward, that they be filed as an original and for. The 60th day in this matter is September 20. I would prefer not to set a trial date today, but allow you to do that when you appear with Judge Ito in his court next Friday. Is that acceptable?
Yes, Your Honor, so long as there is no time waiver and the time starts to run.
I haven't asked for one, and time starts to run from today, and I computed its 60th day as being September 20.
That is acceptable. Okay. Your Honor, may I address the court on the next procedures on Friday?
Sure.
We have a motion that is going to be filed this morning that deals with the DNA testing that we have been notified will start and take place on Tuesday at a private laboratory in Maryland. It was essential that this motion be heard prior to Tuesday, and our motion basically is a request that a sample be preserved so we can conduct our own independent examination.
Let me interrupt you. Do you have any objection to...
Yes, Your Honor. This matter has already been litigated extensively in the municipal court. We presented testimony. An order was made by the judge with respect to all of counsel's contentions. The counsel now intends to raise the matter again. It has been litigated, and if we relitigate this, then there will be a problem with getting the testing done within the time set for trial.
What did the judge down there order you to preserve a sample?
The judge issued an order that went along with the testimony indicating that the defense could be present, will be present to watch all of the testing to the extent that when our testing is completed, there is capability of a split, we will be provided to provide that.
Well, why do we need to address this again?
Your Honor, for two reasons. Number one, that we believe, based on affidavits that have been supplied that will be attached to this motion, that observing others do a DNA test is absolutely no benefit whatsoever. Number two, in the event that is something that the court desires us to do, Dr. Henry Lee, who is our chief criminologist, a year and a half ago has made a commitment to address an international scientific board and be the keynote speaker on Tuesday. We have been formally asked the district attorney to allow us to start these tests, if that is going to be the procedure, on Thursday. Finally, we believe that the municipal court's order has now expired, that the municipal court magistrate has lost jurisdiction, that the testing did not begin during the period that she had jurisdiction, and the matter will be properly brought before Judge Ito.
Well, it's a little bit premature for us to be spending this much time on it since the motion hasn't been filed in any event, but based on what you've told me, Mr. Shapiro, and what I perceive to be your concern that some urgency be attached to the consideration of that motion, if it is filed, I will see that it is placed in Judge Ito's hands today, and if he feels, after reviewing it, that it's a matter that requires his attention prior to Friday, he will cause our staff to contact each of you and set the matter for argument and hearing. On that issue? That issue is closed. I'm not going to talk any more about motions that aren't filed. Any other matters that we need to address at this time?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. Any other matters?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Thanks to each of you. You're welcome. The defendant's remanded in custody of the sheriff without bail.
O.J. Simpson, not just a plea of not guilty, but a plea of absolutely 100% not guilty. He said a much more aggressive look, at least, and sound from Mr. Simpson than we heard during all of the preliminary hearing. Just before we go to our panel in Los Angeles to explain what we've just heard, or I suspect in many cases not.
Tells you a number of things that I'd like to address, at least some of them, with you now. We've already covered the so-called ugly mood by showing you the photograph. We've covered the aspect of the flowers, because Mr. Simpson did get flowers, but he went out and got those flowers. We'll cover the aspect, let me talk to you about Mr. Simpson at that particular recital. I've told you how he came back to California, specifically to go to that recital. That he'd come in to Paul Revere at about 5 o'clock and saw his ex-wife. He had to get his ticket and take his ticket back to the person at the door. That his daughter was 30 or something on the program. You've been to those programs where your child is going to come up and she's like, there's probably 100 people there and your child is like 99th, and you have to be very interested until you get there. So this was like 30-something, and she was at the very end. But as all parents, you kind of sit there and you're really proud of the youngsters, and you do that. As the program was going, he remembered that he didn't have any flowers. So when he first got there and he was sitting, he was 2 seats away from his ex-wife, Miss Nicole Brown Simpson. Wasn't staring at anybody. Wasn't glaring at anybody. Wasn't jealous about anything. In fact, you'll hear the conversation he had with Ron Goldman, who was still in the group. There was a group of them who ran around together in Brentwood. And O.J. Simpson was commiserating with Ron Goldman about his problems he was having. Please forgive me. Ron Fishman, excuse me. I heard those sounds. I'm sorry about that. Thank you. Ron Fishman. He's the man who took this picture here. He was talking about his problems with Cora Fishman and the group that ran around together. The testimony will be that he was saying, I'm glad to be out of it. I'm back with Paula. And was he back with Paula? Yes, he's back with Paula. The night before this trial is over, we'll have another picture, but this picture will do for now. By the way, this is Mr. Douglas is going to help us because there are some graphics and things. Hope you'll bear with us. Thank you, Mr. Douglas. Your Honor, you please see this picture. Would you like to sit there? We'll call this, this is...
I thought we had agreed that it would be defense 1, 2, 3, 4.
I think the clerk has not changed it.
Right. But we're going to have so many, Mrs. Robertson. I thought we agreed on this. For now, we'll call it defense 2. And Mrs. Robertson will explain to me the error of my ways at lunchtime.
You are in charge.
No, I'm not.
Oh, I see. This is in 201. And number 201 is another example of O.J. Simpson. This photograph, there'll be testimony, was taken on June 11th, on Saturday, June 11th. That is a charitable fundraiser. I think $25,000 a plate, by the way, to the benefit of Israel. And that's O.J. Simpson there. Now, that night, on Saturday, June 11th, he went with his girlfriend, Paula Barberi, who had picked him up at the airport on Friday evening, June 10th, when he came back from working in the East from New York. They spent that time together, and they went out Saturday evening. And so this picture, again, is graphic evidence of O.J. Simpson and who he really is, it seems, to us. As I said, there is another picture of Paula Barberi with him there that we don't have yet, but that we will. Now, Mr. Darden talked a lot about Miss Simpson being weak and that he exercised all this control over her and picked her friends. The evidence will show that Miss Nicole Brown Simpson was a very strong, independent woman, very attractive, and an excellent and wonderful mother. But the one thing they never fought over or never had any arguments about were those children. But they both mutually loved those beautiful children, and that was very, very important, it seems, to both of them. That she picked and chose her own friends. That O.J. Simpson or no one else could tell her who her friends were to be. She had whatever friends she wanted. She did whatever she wanted. He tells you about 2 incidents where he alleges there's stalking. Let me tell you the facts and the true facts about those incidents, backed up with witnesses. There's a man in Los Angeles named Joe Stellini who owns a restaurant on the west side out on Pico. He's a good friend of O.J. Simpson's. They went out to dinner one night. And while out to dinner, they became aware of Miss Nicole Brown Simpson and their party. This is the time when they were separated. And they had an agreement, generally, that if one or the other came in while they were there, the person who was there first would leave or whatever. There wouldn't be any problems. The incident regarding Joe Stellini had nothing to do with Miss Nicole Brown Simpson or her party. He was out to dinner. They might frequent the same kinds of places. You'll hear from Joe Stellini, and you'll see it was not anything about any stalking. The other incident was about Mezzaluna, I believe. It was an incident where they both were at this restaurant. Mr. Simpson's party had already been seated when he came in. And again, you'll hear from these parties who will tell you that these were not any stalking incidents. If you live in Brentwood and there are restaurants, hot restaurants in that area, and you go out to dinner a lot, you're going to run into each other. And there was no hostility, no stalking, no jealousy, no nothing. And so he tries to paint O.J. Simpson as a jealous man. Let me tell you what the evidence is going to be about that. You heard about this incident of Keith Zlomowitz. I'm sure as a witness who's going to be called. Mr. Garden described it. Remember, he said yesterday, well, he didn't punch out Nicole and he didn't punch out Keith, or words to that effect. He certainly didn't. What happened was, Mr. Simpson, in one of these incidents, had seen his ex-wife out. They went out dancing afterwards. And he stopped by our house afterwards to try to talk to her. He would go by and woo her on occasion. And the evidence will be that when they first broke up, he was advised in January of 1992 that she wanted a divorce. Between January and April of 1992, it was hard on him. Knowing somebody for 17 years, he didn't want to lose her. He likes family. He learned that from his mother, and he's got this close-knit family. And he likes that. He loved his children. He didn't want to lose his wife. But something happened in April of 1992. As soon as he became aware that she had a boyfriend, from that point on, his interest changed, and he went on. And when he saw what he saw with Keith and Mrs. Simpson, he then went on with his life with Paula. That's when it started, in April of 1992. And so what happened was he wasn't peering in any windows. He came to the front door to try to see his wife. And he looked in, and he saw his wife making love to a gentleman on that couch. Now, according to Chris Darden, wouldn't you expect that he would just blow up, become ballistic? He went home, the evidence will be. He came back the next day to talk to Mrs. Simpson about the fact that the kids were upstairs, and what he saw them doing, he didn't think would be appropriate. One of the kids came downstairs. And so when he came back on the next day of this incident, he saw Keith, I think, sitting astride Miss Nicole Brown Simpson, giving her a massage or something in her shoulders. O.J. Simpson talked to both of them, shook Keith's hand, went on his way, and said essentially, look, I don't think you should be doing this in front of the kids or whatever. They didn't tell you that Keith Zlomowitz moved in with Nicole that summer. But O.J. Simpson was back with Paula. Didn't bother him. He knew she was there, that Keith was there. Was he stalking? Was he jealous? Was that a rage? I think not. So, again, I want you to take these facts and look at them. But there's an even more painful incident, probably. It tells you that he's not jealous. He has a very close friend, somebody who's very near and dear to him. The evidence will show who had a relationship with Nicole Brown Simpson, because she told him so when they got back together, and this gentleman told him so. And it was hurtful, but he never said a harsh word to her or this gentleman. He didn't go ballistic. He didn't do any of those things. In fact, you know what he did? He let this gentleman get married at his Rockingham house after learning this gentleman had been intimate with his wife. That's what O.J. Simpson did on that occasion. Your Honor, may I put your name?
Just in case you've just joined us, the camera in the courtroom today is quite fixed. It does not have the range of that it had yesterday. Not altogether sure precisely why Mr. Cochran has taken this brief chance to consult. We do know that the judge has decided that it will be permissible at some point for...
10-minute recess. Love the tie.
For Pan.
All right. Let's take a 10-minute recess, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll just step back into the jury room, and we'll resume in 10 minutes.
Okay. You hear that as clear?
I think that speaks volumes about Mr. Simpson, his stability, his relationship with his ex-wife. I think the evidence will also show that in about May of 1992, Ms. Nicole Brown Simpson came over to the Rockingham house and said she'd found a boyfriend, somebody different than Keith, where the incident was April of 1992, and asked Mr. Simpson for some advice. He, of course, knew at that point that it was over and he was back with Paula and went on with his life, as I said, until such time as in 1993. She decided she wanted to get back together at that point. Now, to clear up, I want to always keep the faith with you about being as accurate as I can. The two incidents that they talked about, on the one incident involving the man Joe Stellini, that was at Mezzaluna. The other incident was a restaurant called Tryst. In both incidents, there was no problem, no fight. In fact, in the Tryst incident, I believe it was, at the Mezzaluna incident, Mr. Simpson went home with his wife that night. So that there was not any incident where they were stalking or fighting, anything like that. There was no obsessive behavior. I hope that we put those in some kind of perspective. Mr. Darden talked in his opening statement about a 1985 incident in which some damage was done to a vehicle. And as I understand it, the testimony will be that was not any incident in 1985 because Miss Nicole Brown Simpson was pregnant, had a C-section later in that year, and they didn't have any situation like that. They did have some discussion, apparently, maybe in 86 or in 84. There was some damage done to her car, and she was not in that car. She was not struck on that occasion. So I think you'll find an incident of not great consequence. And Mr. Darden talked about the 1993 911 tape that you've heard so much about. And I think even he conceded yesterday that in that situation, although you could hear Mr. Simpson's voice, and he was angry, Mr. Simpson never laid a hand on his wife, never called her a name. And I think the important thing about a trial is that finally you're going to get to hear all of this tape. And what you're going to hear, Mr. Darden didn't tell you this yesterday, is that there was a discussion on this 911 tape. And he alluded to the fact that Mr. Simpson couldn't get out of his mind what he'd seen back on April 1992. Well, now, first of all, most of us might have a problem getting that picture out of our mind, seeing your wife making love to someone else. But at any rate, this wasn't the reason for the argument. What had happened was, and the facts will be, that when they started trying to get back together again in 93, they had an agreement that they would take the pictures of their boyfriends and girlfriends out of the, you put them away, basically, which seemed to be a reasonable request. And there was a dispute because when Miss Brown Simpson would ever see Paula Barberi's picture, she was very upset about that. And Mr. Simpson, on this date, I believe, saw a picture of somebody that she had dated during the time they'd been separated. And he said, gee, what's fair for me would be fair for you. And they got into this conversation that went over a period of time. At some point, it was just a verbal conversation that escalated and tempers flared. It sometimes happens with married couples. Doesn't make it right, but sometimes it happens. He came over to her house, and he did, in fact, kick a French door. The evidence will be the door was already broken. He fixed it, but he never at any time struck his wife during this period of time. And what he was saying, at some point, she says, OJ, be quiet, what about the kids? And he says, essentially. You weren't thinking about the kids and being quiet when you were on the couch with Keith. And I think you'll hear that on the tape. So you put it in perspective, and the important point to make is that nobody was ever injured during this period of time. In fact, there is a tape recording and a transcript from some police officers who came out and talked with these parties. And in that tape, you'll get a chance to hear what Ms. Brown Simpson thought about that incident. And they also talked to O.J., who waited there for him. He agreed to fix that door. And they went on with their lives. They went on and continued during that period of time to get along. This was the time they were back together. You should note that Mr. Simpson, because of how he's conducted his life and the things he's done in his life, has been able to amass some assets. Not bad for a young man, a spindly-legged youth from San Francisco, who suffered with rickets, who had trouble walking, was cared for by his mother, who grew up to become the greatest running back in the history of the National Football League. And so, because of that and his commercial endorsements and things, he's able to have several homes. He has a home in New York. And the evidence will be that in August of each year, because of his commitments with NBC, he would go and live in New York. And so he wouldn't try to control Miss Nicole Brown Simpson. I mean, she would do what she wanted to while he was here. Even during '93, he was living in New York from like August to like January, maybe after the Super Bowl or whatever, so August to January. He'd be back there at his New York house. He also had a house in Laguna Beach in Orange County. And one thing I forgot to tell you about the circle of benevolence. He assisted his wife in buying a condo in Laguna for herself, separate from his house. So when she was at Rockingham, she had 2 condos in her own name. One in Laguna, one in San Francisco, she's getting money from, and living in Rockingham. They didn't tell you about that. He also had bought some property in Cabo San Lucas where he planned to build. All of the things that he was doing was about the family, like keeping the family together, like doing things with in-laws and with friends and with the children. So I think you'll hear evidence about the fact that he was away at great periods of time. And while I'm about that, let me tell you about the kind of schedule this man had. You won't be able to see his calendar yet, but at some point, hopefully, we will. If you went back and looked at Mr. O.J. Simpson's daily calendar from January to June of 1994, you'd find a man that in January was out of town and probably still living in New York almost every day. But he was out of New York because he was traveling. Some of you who know this is Super Bowl week. You can imagine that he was in Atlanta that week, because that's what the Super Bowl was last year. That the evidence will be that this was a time that he and his wife were trying to make it, that he took some family members, the Browns from Germany, to the Super Bowl in Atlanta, paid for all of them, got them 50-yard seats, took them to all the big parties that are going on this week. He was again out of town during almost all of that particular month. If you looked at his calendar and you're able to be testimony that in February, he spent a lot of time in Cabo San Lucas. He was in Nashville, in St. Louis, in Miami. In Miami again, involved in charitable work. A few days where you find he was even here in Los Angeles. If you looked at March, you'd find that he was in New York. He was doing Bryant Gumbel's charitable golf tournament in Orlando, Florida. Back in New York again. He was all over the country doing various and sundry things. You got to the month of April, he was back in Cabo. From there, he came back to Los Angeles. Then he went to Puerto Rico. Evidence will be that some of you know, he's an actor, a would-be actor, and that he made this movie Frogman during that period of time in Puerto Rico. Again, very much out of California. And in May, with the exception of some things that he came to do for his children, and by the way, again, talking about the kind of things that he would do at Rockingham. And you'll see this place at Rockingham. On May 22nd, he had a school picnic at Rockingham. We had a number of kids, and I think that's for the Sunshine Preschool. That is where his son Justin went. It was a fundraiser for this school. They have all these kids, and all the people would come to his house at Rockingham to raise money for the school. On May 22nd, he did that. And Nicole Brown Simpson was there. And even though they had agreed in May, earlier that month in May, and he was now back with Paula, when Nicole Brown Simpson got sick the week of May 15, 1994, she had pneumonia. O.J. Simpson was the one who took her soup, who tried to nurse her back, to get her back on her feet, even though they agreed they weren't going to be together anymore. You heard testimony with regard to that. And he continued, of course, being in and out of town. In June of 1994, he'd had and had taken his two children, Sydney and Justin. And let me say something at this point. Mr. Simpson has two other children that he's equally proud of. The minors cannot be here, obviously, for obvious reasons. But he has two other children that he's equally proud of, and they're here in court today. And there's Arnell Simpson over there and Jason Simpson, sitting between his two sisters, Carmelita Duro and Miss Shirley Baker, and the balance of the family, and you've met Miss Eunice Simpson already. So he, on May 5th, attended a pediatric AIDS affair. Again, his interest in children and AIDS and charitable work, along with Paula. And he took the two younger children. It was a real fine day. And that was on that Sunday. On that Tuesday, he left to go to Washington, D.C. again. He left town. He had to work. On Wednesday, he was working for Hertz in Washington, D.C. On Thursday, he's in Connecticut, working again at one of his board meetings. He's on these various boards, some charitable, some profitable, hopefully. He was in Connecticut. On Friday and Thursday night, he was in New York with his friend Bender. And he'd work, and he'd try to play golf during these periods of time. You recall I mentioned that Mr. Bender had suggested, you're going to be in Chicago on Tuesday or Monday night, stay over. He came home for the recital. And when you see his calendar, you'll see it's planned all the way out, far beyond June, of course, of 1994. But it gives you a sense of this man, this man's life, what he'd been able to do with his life and with himself. I point out these things to you because I think as you look at all of the incidents that Mr. Darden talked about, it puts them into perspective. This is not a case about domestic abuse. It's a murder case. It's a murder case about who did these horrible crimes. That's going to be your decision. Not to think that O.J. Simpson is a bad guy or a good guy, for that matter, but to get a picture of him. But I think that you'll agree with me that after you hear the facts, you'll have a clearer picture. Now, about the we talked about the 1993 incident, I think we did. And I think those are the main incidents that Mr. Darden talked about. One thing I wanted to point out to you is that there will be, I believe, testimony that as these parties got a divorce, as so often happens, Miss Nicole Brown Simpson had her deposition taken. And she made a statement in that deposition with regard to whether or not he'd ever physically struck her after the '89 incident. And it'll be interesting to hear what that is. That this Mark Furman becomes even more relevant in this case as we go along and discuss it, because he was the officer who had supposedly responded, he says, in '85. There's other evidence that the incident involving the bat and the Mercedes was not in '85 because she was pregnant. But he writes a report 4 years later, in '89, saying he had an indelible impression of Mr. O.J. Simpson and coming to that location. An indelible impression. So we'll have to pursue what that means in this report that he wrote about that incident some 4 years later and whether or not it was accurate. It was not done contemporaneously with the incident. Mr. Darden also said to us that this was not a tabloid prosecution. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? He used those words, didn't he? He said, first of all, this wasn't character assassination, which we now know it was. And he says it's not a tabloid prosecution. Well, I think the evidence will be that after this book that you've heard about from his so-called friend Faye Resnick came out, it's when the people started getting all these witnesses who wanted to come forward, talk about these incidents. So whether or not it's a tabloid prosecution is not for me to say, it's going to be for you to say. Let me say this about Faye Resnick.
Counsel,
I'm
sorry to interrupt, Mr.
Okay. Go ahead,
Your
sir.
Honor, once again, my objection has been previously noted.
I caution you, Mr. Carkin, about what you're just about to launch into, because that person's not on the witness list. And when you say, let me tell you about somebody, I'm concerned.
Right. You're right. And there's a possibility that...
All right,
Well,
I think we should hear these objections at the sidebar.
Okay.
However,
And,
Mr.
I tell you, let's do it without the recording. I think we can resolve it. Okay?
Please.
Another objection there from Bill Hodgman. The early take on these objections was, they were all overruled by Judge Ito early on, was that he'd given the prosecution some considerable latitude yesterday, and so...
We may call her for a number of reasons, because...
Object, Your Honor. There's only a possibility.
Counsel, overruled.
The reason why I think the evidence will show and will be relevant to you is that on or about June 3rd of 1994, Faye Resnick, who had had a long-time relationship with a Dr. Christian Reichart, whom we will definitely be calling, they'd been living together for a long time. And because of her drug usage, because of the fact she was freebasing cocaine, he put her out literally. They broke up. She was one of these parties who they ran in this circle out there in Brentwood. And when she was put out on June 3rd, which I think was a Friday, she then moved over and lived with Nicole Brown Simpson, because they were friends. They would go out at night. These were all friends. The evidence will be these ladies would go out 2, 3, 4 nights a week and stay out till 5 o'clock in the morning. Nobody was controlling these women. There's a group of them, and you'll hear about it. They go out dancing, they do whatever they would do, and we know Faye Resnick was using drugs in this period of time. It got so bad, the evidence will be that on June 8th, 1994, they had what we call an intervention, that Nicole and Kristen Reichart and her former husband, Paul Resnick, all got together to try and convince her that she had to go into a drug treatment facility called Exodus. And on the 8th of June...
Excuse me, counsel. I'm sorry once again. Your Honor, you had asked us or given us leave to address these issues.
Overruled. Please be seated.
In a noon hour.
Please be seated.
Very well.
Thank you.
Goes into a drug treatment facility on June 8th, and she remains there, and she's there on June 12th. And I think you hear from the evidence that she is one of the people who calls Miss Nicole Brown Simpson on the night of June 12th, perhaps after 9 o'clock, that particular night, from this drug treatment facility. We'll be talking about that and her role in this whole drama. To conclude, then, what I've tried to do in this opening statement is to lay out for you the fact that in almost everything you hear in this case, there are two sides. That as jurors, I'm sure you're not going to rush to judgment. But this should not be a case about character assassination, and I hope you will keep an open mind until you hear all of the evidence as it relates to who Mr. Simpson is. Now, shifting our attention now to the discussion, the very able discussion of Miss Marcia Clark yesterday. It seemed to me, as you summarized what she had to say to you, that her argument broke down, or, well, it was argument at the end, but her opening statement broke down into a discussion of timeline and so-called evidence trails. Let me first of all talk to you about the concept of the timeline. We've talked a little bit about that. And let me tell you what she didn't tell you about. And some of this we'll cover, so I won't be redundant. But there are witnesses like the lady who lived next door to Mr. Simpson. There's a Mr. Tom Lang that she knows about and didn't tell you about, who on this particular night, June 12th, 1994, was walking his dog on a street called Dorothy Street, right down the way from Mr. Cole Brown Simpson's condo at 875. That from his vantage point, just a short distance on the corner, he looked up and he saw a lady that he believes was Miss Nicole Brown Simpson, either embracing someone at a vehicle at the curb, and behind Miss Simpson, he saw a man that he described as a Hispanic or Caucasian standing with his hands clenched, standing there looking as though he was angry. And he didn't know why this man was looking like this. And this is about 10 o'clock on June 12th. Whether he was angry because Mr. Lang didn't know whether he was angry because his dog was loose or what. But again, this is what I expect his testimony to be. This is at 10 o'clock, and he sees a lady that he believes is Nicole Brown Simpson at that point. I talked to you briefly before about Ellen Aronson and Dan Mandel, who she didn't talk to, but she's talked to them, but she didn't talk about them yesterday, as they walked past this place, right at about 10:25 or thereabouts. Then there's another witness, whose name is Robert Heidstra. Robert Heidstra is in an alley one street over. But when you go out there, you'll be able to see how well you can hear late at night, especially on a Sunday night at this location. Mr. Heidstra, according to his statements, is walking in this alley. And now it's about 10:35 or 10:40. As he walks parallel to where the Bundy residence is, will be then looking west, he hears the sound of like arguing, and he hears someone or a voice say, "Hey, hey, hey," and he hears the sound of a fence closing, and he continues on walking his dog. Now this is at 10:40 or thereabouts, and you know then at 10:45, Marianne Gertrude sees these four men running from 875 down toward her direction, and she believes they're coming after her at that point. In her statement to you yesterday, Ms. Clark talked to you a lot about Alan Park, and I read you some of his transcripts, some of his testimony that you didn't hear about. And I think there'll be considerably more with regard to Mr. Park and to Mr. Cato, Cato Kalin. An interesting man, and I think that it'll be interesting when you hear from Mr. Cato Kalin about Mr. Simpson and how he appeared that night. Just before we wrap up for lunch, I think the evidence will show you that in order to believe that O.J. Simpson committed these horrible murders, you'd have to believe that he came back from back east where he'd been working to come to his daughter's recital, attended that recital. You see his picture there. He was home getting ready for a trip to Chicago that had been long pre-planned, that he was hungry. The evidence will be that he didn't have any dollar bills or $20 bills, that he asked to borrow some money from Cato Kalin. Cato Kalin gave him this money. He went and had a Big Mac. You'd have to believe that he was planning to kill his wife either before he got this Big Mac or then went and got the Big Mac, that Cato Kalin will describe. He was dressed in some kind of a sweat clothes and some tennis shoes. If you follow the People's Case, you'd have to believe that he then came home and said, "Gee, I think what I'll do is I'll go over and kill my wife now, and I think I'll take these tennis shoes off and put on some dress shoes, some hard-soled shoes, and change clothes," knowing he's going to be leaving shortly to go to the airport. And then you'd have to believe that, to believe their theory. And then to make their theory work, they spend all this time talking about the plaintive wail of a dog, because they've got to make this as early as possible at 10:15. We know that that's not correct, based upon the facts that you've heard. And to conclude, isn't it interesting that in all of the discussion yesterday by these two very excellent lawyers, they never once mentioned their coroner, Dr. Golden. He's another mysterious mystery witness they don't want to talk about. And when we come back this afternoon, let's talk about why the prosecution doesn't want you to know about Dr. Golden. Let's talk about when Ms. Clark says, well, you can't really fix the time of death here with any precision. We will have testimony from one of the leading pathologists in the United States, Michael Batten, who's also worked for the LA County District Attorney's Office, who's written a book about the John Belushi death. He was able to pinpoint the time of death to within 1 hour. And yet in this case, because the coroner was not called for 10 hours after these bodies were found, or 8 hours, and they got out there about 10 hours, violating the state law, we are precluded from pinpointing this. And they have to tell you that it's about a dog's way on. When a man's life is at stake. We'll pick up after lunch, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Cochran. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will stand in recess for the...
That the coroner's office wrote a letter to Mr. Hodgman with an amendment to the coroner's report they filed. And I'd like at this time to turn our attention to the graphics. This is a letter that is directed to our colleague, Mr. William Hodgman. You'll see Mr. Hodgman there. And we'll proceed on.
D88.
It'll become clearer.
Your Honor, excuse me. May we have... I have an objection to interpose. I wish to approach at sidebar, and I would like this image stricken from the screen for a moment.
Well, we did tell you that Bill Hodgman was going to go on his feet. I'm just going to guess at this going on here, and it would only be a guess. Maybe Peter Aranella or Bob can help me, Bob Filibosian. I think that Mr. Hodgman is concerned here, Robert Filibosian, that they haven't seen this document and they don't know what's going to be presented, correct or not?
Well, that's the way it looks, because if they have such a document and they've shown it to the prosecution, this is the kind of document that certainly may be introduced during the course of the cross-examination of the coroner to impeach his testimony. That is, if he's made some error or has made some retraction of some conclusion that he reached, then a letter from him stating that should be available to the defense. Apparently it was, but it looks like they didn't tell the prosecution that they were going to use it. We'll find out more if we hear an explanation.
Are we watching fairly standard tactics here now on both sides?
Well, it is not standard to surprise the other side. Normally, in these trials, especially now that we have reciprocal discovery in California, there are no surprises. It used to be, before reciprocal discovery, everything the defense did was a surprise to the prosecution. Prosecution had no idea what the defense was going to be or where the defense was going to go until opening statement was made. That's all changed now so that both sides get a fair trial and crime victims are treated hopefully the same as criminal defendants. But there still are surprises occasionally, and we've certainly seen them in this particular case.
One of the reasons Mr. Hodgman objected to the mention of these two new issues to these witnesses, Marianne Gerges and Joe Stellini, is because in their investigation, the defense does not always take notes when they talk to people who might be witnesses or at least constitute evidence in some form. And the reason they do not, I've been told by our legal analyst earlier, so that they do not have to hand over those notes to the prosecution. Is that what Bill Hodgman is objecting to today, Peter Aranella?
I don't think so. At least in terms of this particular letter, it was my understanding, unless I didn't hear correctly, that this is a letter from the coroner's office to Bill Hodgman, to the assistant district attorney. So they obviously have notice and are aware of this. What they're surprised by, perhaps, is that this is evidence that the defense intends to admit. Though, again, I'm a little bit surprised that they'd be surprised.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll just wait for it. Sometimes we have a tendency to try to provide you the answers even before they can.
Conversation and meeting between the LA County coroner who did the autopsy here, Dr. Golden, his boss, Dr. Lakshmanan, and then our experts. Now, we expect that when Dr. Batten is called to testify in this case, he'll make a number of findings because he was there, was able to review all these records, and expect the evidence to show, while we're talking about coroners, that he will testify that the injuries and bruises on Mr. Ronald Goldman's hands indicate that he had struck his assailant, and yet there was a fight, a major fight, prior to his death. That proper forensic procedures would preserve the stomach contents of the deceased, as I've indicated to you. That in this case, there was no rape or semen kit analysis performed, and we would expect that the expert would testify that a semen rape kit analysis is standard procedure for coroner's offices in the United States at this time in June of 1994. We will also testify, I believe, that closer to the time of death, one takes the temperature of a victim, their livor mortis and their rigor mortis, as the likelihood of an accurate result increases, and that's very important. He will say also, I believe, that the killings would have resulted in an enormous amount of loss of blood. And of course, you've seen that evidence of which would be expected to be on the perpetrator. I would have expected the person who committed these horrible crimes would be covered with blood. Dr. Baden, and along his colleague also Dr. Wolf, examined histology samples and pointed out to the coroner's office a bruising of the brain that Dr. Golden had missed. They pointed out some findings that their coroner's office had actually missed, and they advised them and let them know. There was then a supplemental report filed regarding that also. Dr. Baden, as the expert, will testify that the LA County Coroner's Office violated their own procedures in performing these two autopsies. He will indicate further that the autopsy findings in this case are consistent with the struggle that resulted in hand-to-hand combat. That Mr. Goldman did in fact bleed profusely, and he bled slowly, and that he was standing through most of this. And that in his opinion, the perpetrator would be covered with Mr. Goldman's blood. Also, Dr. Baden will testify that there are blood drops on the back of Miss Nicole Brown Simpson, and there were no swabs taken. In fact, when the body was moved and taken to the lab, those blood drops, which very well may have been of the perpetrator, were wiped off or washed off, never preserved. And so, what I expect the evidence to show through our testimony and through cross-examinations, I've indicated that the coroner's investigators who came to that scene also didn't wear any covering over their shoes. But, we expect you'll be able to see that this scene was tracked through and traipsed through by the coroner's people, just as it had been by the LAPD people. And at some time in this trial, we hope to have some graphic video evidence of that fact to you, so you can see for yourself. In short, what, from our standpoint, from the defense standpoint, in wanting a fair trial, being able to defend our clients, the actions of the coroner's office has obviously made everyone's job, and specifically the defense's job, much more difficult. That when the LAPD failed to notify the coroner's office for 10 hours, violating the state law, it made everybody's job more difficult. If Dr. Golden, if and when he testifies, as he testified at the preliminary hearing, and asked questions as to whether or not there could have been 2 knives used in these 2 killings, will indicate that some of the wounds on these 2 victims are consistent with a double-edged knife. Some are consistent with a single-edged knife or blade. So that would be consistent that perhaps 2 knives were used. And I think that we can expect that from his testimony either by the people or by us if he is called to so testify. In addition to Dr. Michael Baden, we will have for you to testify Dr. Henry Lee, the foremost forensic crime scene analyst in America. He is head of the state of Connecticut lab. He'll be here to share with you his findings with regard to this crime scene and what took place at that crime scene and the contamination of the evidence thereof. Now, with regard to the opening statement yesterday, as I said, you were told that in this case, the coroner's office couldn't do any better than 3 hours. And I think that with the evidence we've shown you, we're going to show that they could have done an awful lot better. And we'll have other cases to cite for that. I've covered with you this morning the question of the timeline. We'll talk about that at the very end again. Ms. Clark talks about a trail of blood where there is no trail. And we will expect to have evidence showing that whereas she told you yesterday, time and time again, that they were looking for matches to exclude, that what she did not tell you was that there are trails that lead toward innocence, and they were not pursued. Let me give you some examples based upon the evidence that I expect to produce in this trial. There is, and I'll go through this list for you. Expect the evidence to show that there was blood under Miss Nicole Brown Simpson's fingernails. It came back a type B in an EAP genetic marker. And that does not fit the genetic profile of Mr. Simpson, Mr. Goldman, or Miss Brown. Some other person. That there was blood found on Miss Nicole Brown Simpson's thigh. And that came back also for type B. There was, as you might imagine in this case, all kinds of evidence that's come forward, people who want to volunteer things. There was a knife found shortly after these killings. And the blood on one of the knives found also was this type B, similar to the blood that was found under Miss Nicole Brown Simpson's fingernails. You would expect that blood would be of the perpetrator since it's not hers. We will, in a short time, show you a graphic of several things in that connection. There were identifiable fingerprints which not match and don't match Mr. O.J. Simpson or any of the police officers there. And this becomes relevant, we think, because the contention of the prosecution is that one of the gloves was lost in this struggle, supposedly. There are identifiable palm prints. There's no match to Mr. O.J. Simpson. Our experts will testify there are different patterns of shoe imprints at this scene, indicating perhaps more than one person. No mention of that thus far. We expect that to be the testimony. There are no hairs on the Bundy glove that are matched to Mr. O.J. Simpson. There are negroid hairs on the knit cap at Bundy that do not match Mr. O.J. Simpson. But the prosecution has never, to this date, done any DNA tests, as we know, as far as we know, rather, on the Bundy glove. Testing has been slow. That when the investigators arrived at the scene of these double murders, she talked to you about somebody named Detective Risky. Well, Risky may have been the officer who came there, but this case was assigned to Phillips and Furman. This was their case. This is West Los Angeles homicide. Phillips and Furman. That it was transferred from them because of the high-profile nature of the case to robbery homicide thereafter. But Phillips and Furman continue to play an active role in this case. You will hear very, very little about an officer Risky. But one of the interesting things I think you'll find about this crime scene is the dearth or lack of any photographs, examination, or investigation inside that house. I don't think you'll find one photograph from inside that house. There will be some evidence that the officers who arrived at that scene, shortly after finding these bodies, found a partially melting cup of ice cream from Ben & Jerry's. We don't have that. I don't know that there were no pictures taken of it, so we don't have any way of seeing how much it was melted. We're precluded from that at this point. This was found near the back of the residence of the Bundy home. You heard a lot yesterday about blood drops at Bundy. Well, as you could tell, there are obviously thousands and thousands of drops of blood at that scene. Ms. Clark talked to you about 5 blood drops. But we expect the evidence to show that the blood drops that they found had very, very little DNA. And in the graphic soon I will try to demonstrate for you the amount of the DNA found in these blood drops. which meant that these blood drops, according to our experts, were either old or degraded, contaminated by people who collected them and tested them. And of course, the blood drops at Bundy are in an area where Mr. Simpson and his children have obviously been on many occasions. There were tire tracks in the back of the house which have not been matched to any of Mr. O.J. Simpson's vehicle. Now, one of the things that we expect to show during the course of this our presentation of evidence is that there was, in fact, a major struggle. And Mr. Goldman fought valiantly. He was apparently physically fit, 5'10" and 170 plus. He was stabbed a number of times, perhaps 30, and there was blood on his hands and arms. He had a number of defensive wounds. And the experts will testify that you would expect that the perpetrators, that Mr. Goldman's blood would be all over the perpetrator's clothes, hair, all over his body. In fact, he would be saturated with Mr. Goldman's blood. And of course, under the prosecution's theory, the perpetrator was driving that Bronco that night. And there's no evidence of Goldman's or Nicole Simpson's bloodstains inside that Bronco of the amount that you would expect, given this situation, that the pattern of blood that they talked about yesterday, the small, very small pattern of blood in that vehicle, is very consistent with what I expect you will hear is a statement made by Mr. Simpson. Now, Ms. Clark went on yesterday and said that with regard to the DNA evidence, she talked a little bit about DNA. She didn't talk about or make a distinction for you between the RFLP, the restriction fragment length polymorphism, or the polymerase chain reaction, the PCR, of which our expert basically invented it. But I think what you'll find is this is very, very sensitive evidence that is then Xeroxed up, molecular Xeroxing, and we'll talk about that a little more later. We think the evidence will show that the pattern before I tell you that, I think the evidence will also show that on the steering column of the Bronco, item number 29, the people's exhibits, I don't think you were told this yesterday, that they did not talk about a DNA mixture consistent with, not necessarily a match, consistent with Mr. Simpson and someone other than Nicole or Ronald Goldman, some other person. That with regard to Rockingham, Mr. Simpson's residence, again, I expect there will be testimony that Mr. Simpson did, in fact, cut his finger in some place where I'm pointing now, near the end of this middle finger. And he so told the police that evening, on January 13th, and that he went out, he did it either as he's about to leave or whatever, he went out to the Bronco to get his cellular phone. That what I think you will find and what I think the evidence will show is that the reason there was no blood coming up the stairs, and this carpet in this house, I think you'll find the evidence will show, is largely white, largely very light. If you have a jury view, you'll be able to see it for yourself. You didn't find any blood other than what you saw outside and just in that entryway. And I think you'll find that leads toward the kitchen. And there'll undoubtedly be testimony with regard to that injury, if any, occurring before he ever left for Chicago. There will be, as I understand the evidence, no trace of blood on the white carpet, upstairs or up on the stairs or upstairs. No trace of blood on the white carpet from any bloody shoes. No trace of blood on the white carpet from any bloody pants or shirts. And no trace of blood on this white carpet from any bloody socks. The evidence will show that in an effort to find any evidence, not to exclude, but to include Mr. Simpson, they searched everywhere in the area in Los Angeles, They searched in Chicago. They searched everywhere they possibly could think. And they did not find any weapon or any clothes, because Mr. Simpson, the evidence will show, did not have one. They took apart traps and pipes from his sink, showers and plumbing, and searched everywhere for these various things. The evidence will also show that with regard to Miss Nicole Brown Simpson,
Mr. Heisman? All right.
We have another sidebar so far. We thought we had
they talked about a mysterious disappearing black bag. We expect there will be videos in this case. That the black bag, I presume she was talking about, was Mr. Simpson brought back with him from Chicago. It can be seen clearly with that video, with that black bag. And I believe it was in police custody, certainly at one point. I know they had it in their custody. And so it didn't seem to us that's a big mystery, but we'll have to look at the evidence as it develops. But we're not aware of any missing black bag that Mr. Simpson has or whatever. So looking at the evidence at Rockingham, and then there's this Rockingham glove that's supposedly found in an area that you saw some pictures about yesterday. Mr. Simpson's home. It's a very, very narrow pathway on the side of his house. You saw the pictures of this glove, which was on top of some leaves. There will be no testimony, as I understand it, about any blood drops leading to and from that. But as I expect the evidence will show, there's a fence right up there close by this blood drop. This pathway leads basically to a backyard area that's kind of basically enclosed. I think there's maybe a gate on one side. I think the evidence will show if somebody wanted to come in the house on that side, and you'll see this when you go out there, there are at least 2 doors on that side that somebody could go right inside the house without climbing over a fence or anything of that nature. You will see the evidence, and again, you will be the one who can help make those facts. But with regard to this glove, which was, and then again, I think that, let me try to set the record straight for you. This glove was not found by them or the officers or whatever. This glove was found by Detective Furman. He found it, and he then individually took these other officers back there supposedly to see it. They had supposedly brought a photographer over there to take pictures of it. Although you didn't hear that yesterday, those are the facts as I understand them. As I said, there's no blood trail to these leaves. The leaves don't appear to be disturbed. There's no evidence